72 of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to continue its study. And I see, Mr. Cooper, you've raised your hand.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to move a motion on notice pertaining to the order of reference from the House arising from the question of privilege concerning the intimidation campaign orchestrated by an operative at Beijing's Toronto consulate against the member for Wellington Halton Hills, Michael Chong. And I will now, Madam Chair, I will now read. The motion will be distributed, and I will read the motion now into the record. That in relation to its order of reference of Wednesday, May 10th, 2023, concerning the intimidation campaign orchestrated by Wei Zhao against the member for Wellington Halton Hills and other members, the committee, A, make use for the purposes of this study of the evidence received during its study on foreign election interference without limiting the witnesses who may be called. B, make use for the purposes of this study of the evidence received by the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics during its study on foreign interference without limiting the witnesses who may be called. C, invite each of the following to appear on their own. 1, the Honourable Michael Chong for 1 hour. 2, Eric Jantz, Acting Clerk of the House of Commons for 1 hour. 3, the Honourable Melanie Joly, Minister of Foreign Affairs for 1 hour. 4, the Honourable Marco Mendicino, Minister of Public Safety for 1 hour. 5, the Honourable Bill Blair, President of the King's Privy Council for Canada and the Minister of Emergency Preparedness for 1 hour. 6, Jody Thomas, National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister for 2 hours. 7, David Vineau, Director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service for 2 hours. 8, David Morrison, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and former Acting National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister for 2 hours. 9, Mike MacDonald, former Acting National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister for 1 hour. 10, Vincent Rigby, former National Security Advisor, former National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister for 1 hour. 11, Michelle Duhem, Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for 1 hour. 12, Kong Pei Wu, Ambassador of the People's Republic of China to Canada for 2 hours. D, directs the parties to provide their preliminary lists to other witnesses to the clerk of the committee within 1 week. E, order the production, 1, within 1 week of the July 2021 CSIS report entitled People's Republic of China, Foreign Interference in Canada, a Critical National Security Threat, together with all records concerning the transmission to, distribution within, analysis of, and handling by the Prime Minister's Office, the Privy Council Office, the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, and the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness of this report, and 2, within 3 weeks of all other memoranda, briefing notes, emails, records of conversations, and any other relevant documents, including any drafts which are in the possession of any government department or agency, including the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force, the Critical Election Incident Protocol Panel, any minister's office, and the Prime Minister's Office, containing information concerning planning or efforts by or on behalf of foreign governments or other foreign state actors to intimidate a member of the House of Commons, provided that 3, these documents be deposited without redaction with the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel in both official languages. 4, a copy of the documents shall also be deposited with the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel in both official languages with any proposed redaction of information which, in the government's opinion, could reasonably be expected to compromise the identities of employees or sources of intelligence collecting methods of Canadian or allied intelligence agencies. 5, the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel shall notify the committee whether the office is satisfied that the documents were produced as ordered, and if not, the chair shall be instructed to present forthwith on behalf of the committee a report to the House outlining the material facts of the situation. 6. The office of the law clerk and parliamentary counsel shall assess the redactions proposed by the government pursuant to subparagraph 4 to determine whether the office agrees that the proposed redactions conform with the criteria set out in subparagraph 4, and A, if it agrees, it shall provide the documents as redacted by the government pursuant to subparagraph 4 to the clerk of the committee, or B, if it disagrees with some or all of the proposed redactions, it shall provide a copy of the documents redacted in the manner of the office determines would conform with the criteria set out in paragraph 4, together with a report indicating the number, extent, and nature of the government's proposed redactions which were disagreed with to the clerk of the committee, and 7. The clerk of the committee shall cause the documents provided by the office of the law clerk and parliamentary counsel pursuant to subparagraph 4 to be distributed to the members of the committee and to be published on the committee's website forthwith upon receipt, and F, makes the evidence received during the study available for its study on foreign election interference. And may I continue, Madam Chair? Madam Chair, this motion arises from a question of privilege on a matter that is about as serious as it gets. We have a situation in which 2 years ago, an accredited Beijing diplomat at the Toronto consulate arranged to intimidate a sitting member of parliament by threatening to sanction and punish his family in Hong Kong because that member put forward a motion calling out the Beijing regime for perpetrating genocide against Uyghur Muslims. This is an attack on this House, on every member of Parliament. It's an attack on our democracy. It is an attempt to interfere with a member of this House's ability to do his job, to stand up on behalf of his constituents and on behalf of Canadians, which every member of this House should be able to do free of interference. CSIS had identified that this Beijing operative, this Beijing diplomat, had been involved in orchestrating this intimidation campaign 2 years ago, and it was revealed in a memo, documented in a memo. And yet, for 2 years, the member for Wellington Halton Hills, Mr. Chong, was kept in the dark. The Prime Minister incredibly claims that he first learned of this in the Globe and Mail and not 2 years ago, even though the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, Jody Thomas, told Mr. Chong that the memo had been distributed to relevant departments as well as the National Security Advisor of PCO. So one of two scenarios are possible, neither of which is good for the Prime Minister. Either the Prime Minister is not telling the truth, that he was briefed and he kept the member for Wellington Halton Hills in the dark, he covered it up, and turned a blind eye to a Beijing diplomat intimidating a sitting member of Parliament and threatening the safety and security of that member's family. Or the Prime Minister is incompetent and has set up a structure in which he has been kept in the dark and is not being brought up to speed with respect to what, as I said at the outset, is a matter that could not be more serious. A Beijing diplomat trying to intimidate a sitting member of Parliament from doing their job by threatening the safety and security of their family. In either case, it underscores that this Prime Minister is simply unfit for the job when it comes to protecting Canada's national interests and defending the safety and security of Canadians, and is further evidence that this is a Prime Minister that does not take Beijing's interference seriously. And I have to say, it's very disappointing that in the face of the Prime Minister's inaction, his incompetence, his neglect, and arguably the possibility that he is lying or not being forthcoming, I'll withdraw lying, but not being forthcoming, not telling the full truth, that the Prime Minister would then go out on a campaign to try to attack and impugn the character of the member for Wellington Halton Hills by spreading misinformation that the member had been briefed 2 years ago when he had not, and sent and directed two members of Parliament, including the member for Kingston and the Islands, to spread that misinformation in the House. It's about as low as it gets.
Point of order. Yeah, just on that point, Madam Speaker, there was, I did make a statement, which I then later clarified and apologized for the manner in which that was received. But I'm just curious why we even have to do this study if Mr. Cooper's already come to all the conclusions.
I think we will return. I know Mr. Cooper's wrapping up. I do watch the House even when I'm not in the House, and I know you've clarified that point several times, but repetition works in this place. Mr. Cooper?
So thank you, Madam Chair. The bottom line is we need to get to the bottom of what happened with who had this memo, how the memo was transmitted, when it was distributed, to whom it was distributed, and that is provided for in this motion. It's not only a matter of calling witnesses, it's a matter of producing the evidence, and not just documents, but following the timeline, following exactly how that memo was distributed to find out exactly who knew and when. And I would hope that in the spirit of the unanimous vote on the question of privilege, that this motion will also be unanimously adopted. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Green?
Thank you very much. And for those, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you all here today. It's kind of a continuation of some of our work at Ethics. For those of you that have had the privilege of working with, you'll know that Democrats generally support the production of important documents. You'll also know that in a unanimous way, we've agreed that this is a serious issue. We do have subject matter experts that are going to be presenting to us today. And I would say that, on the record, that we do in principle agree with the production of documents. We do believe that there needs to be a system in place from which a third party can assess what is and what isn't cabinet confidence, national security, and all the other things that we tend to hear at committees that prevent us from getting access to information. So with that being said, I would say that, we would support this, but we are strongly encouraging members around the table to allow us to get back to the matter at hand today, which would include the testimony of key witnesses for the remainder of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Turnbull?
Thanks, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the comments from that everybody's made. Obviously, we all take this matter very seriously. A question of privilege is obviously something that brings concern to all of us as members of Parliament, and in particular in this case, I think is something that we need to get to the bottom of. I wish I'd sort of seen the motion a little bit earlier so I could have sort of reflected on it, because I think there's probably a large degree of agreement on the majority of it. And so I thought, sort of in my mind, I was operating on the assumption that we had probably until Tuesday, based on our previous conversation, to think about additional witnesses, and this sort of is prescriptive of specific witnesses that the Conservative members are putting forward. But I think our team would like to have some time to reflect on what witnesses we'd like to add to the list, and I think we should all parties should have the opportunity to consider that. I also would note that we have 3 panels of witnesses that are lined up for today. Those witnesses, I believe, have been rescheduled, so I don't want to be disrespectful to their time, and I think it's important for us to move forward with committee business for the day. And I think we've operated in this committee, for the most part, the vast majority of the time in good faith, and have reached agreements on, you could even look at the fact that we agreed to study foreign interference before some of these allegations started circulating in the media. So, we've really sort of always, I think, expressed an interest in this topic. And remember that witnesses that are here today are speaking to the topic of foreign election interference, and I think they have important things to contribute. So, so I think, it's an important matter. We're ready to work together, is my general sentiment here. But I think we need a little time to consider the motion. So, but I do believe if we take that time, we'll find a way forward, as we always have done in the past. So with that, I would say I move that the debate be now adjourned.
Being a non-debatable motion, we'll call the question.
Mr. Turnbull,
Yay.
Ms. Romanato,
En faveur.
Ms. Sahota,
Yes.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Yes.
Mr. Fergus,
En faveur.
Mr. Nader,
No.
Mr. Cooper,
No.
Oui.
Mr. Green.
En faveur.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
Motion carries, so thank you for that. I want to just put on the record, and I will be continuing to keep us try to be on track, that I do know some of the parameters. We are working to see, Mr. Chong would be the natural first appearance to make sure that we can try to get him here before constituency week. And then as we determine the witnesses, we'll work to see where we can put them in. After constituency week, we will be heavily on the question of privilege, as members have shared the desire to do so. It remains Tuesday to get witnesses to the clerk, and if a notice has not been sent out yet, it will be shortly sent out. With that, the committee is meeting today to continue its study on foreign election interference. We have with us today Mark Burry, barrister and solicitor, Michelle Juno Katsuya, former chief of the Asia Pacific Unit, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and from the Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute, Peter German, brilliant, barrister and solicitor. You will each have up to 4 minutes for an opening statement, after which we will proceed with questions from committee members. Monsieur Burry, comme vous voulez, dans les deux langues officielles, la parole est à vous.
I'll be making my remarks in English, and I've given them to the translators, and I've sent them to the clerk. I'll start off by saying that the remarks probably will be much more valuable to you if you've got the copy of the Ottawa Magazine article that I sent to the clerk earlier this week. It really has the full story, and 4 minutes certainly can't do it justice. So on that, with the clock running, I'd like to thank you for inviting me. And as you can see in the 2012 email record that I gave to the clerk's office, I'd hoped for this opportunity some time ago. I believe my experience with the Xinhua News Agency might give the committee some useful background and context as it examines China's attempt to extend its influence into Canada's political system. I've been a practicing lawyer for 5 years, but I started writing for newspapers in the late 1970s. I was quite young. I wrote for several daily papers when I was a student. I spent 13 years as a freelancer in the Georgian Bay area of Ontario, writing for the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star. I came to Ottawa in '94 and joined the Press Gallery as a freelancer. Between 1994 and 2007, I wrote for the Toronto Star, the National Post, the Ottawa Citizen, the Hill Times, the Law Times, Canadian Lawyer, and a bunch of other publications that you can see in my CV. In 2004, I started working on my PhD, which was on the press censorship system in the Second World War. And in 2007, I accepted a limited-term teaching appointment at Concordia University in Montreal. In 2009, I finished my doctorate, my teaching contract was over, and I was back in the Press Gallery. Most of my freelance work had been divided up by my colleagues, or the publications had cut back on what they were buying, so there was some adjustment that was needed. At the same time, there were interesting things happening in media. Experiments like BuzzFeed, Vice, Canada Land, iPolitics, Blacklock's, and other non-traditional media were trying to take the place of dying media. And away from the media landscape, there seemed to be real thaw in Chinese Western relationships. Some things to remember for context when you're listening to what I'm going to tell you is that in 2009, Hu Jintao was still president and leader of China. There were still term limits for his positions. China had just come off a successful Summer Olympics. Relations between China and Taiwan seemed to be improving. Canada had sent trained missions to China for years, and all recent governments had tried to get a deal. The Harper government succeeded in 2014. In 2009, representatives of the Chinese news agency Xinhua asked me to write some freelance pieces for them. I had concerns and tried to get advice from CSIS. There was considerable suspicion about Xinhua's operation in Canada among my colleagues and just people on the Hill in general, and I reached out to CSIS for guidance, and I never heard back. Really. Most of my interactions with Xinhua are documented in the Ottawa Magazine piece that I sent to the committee clerk and in the email material that I also forwarded to you. Xinhua was trying to accomplish two things that seemed mutually exclusive but turned out were not. It wanted to make money and expand to become a wire service feeding content to credible news organizations throughout the world. It made deals with large outlets like the Associated Press and with Chinese media in Canada and other places. It also wanted to give credibility to Chinese institutions and the regime. Xinhua was apolitical. I saw no attempt to push the interests of one Canadian political party over another. But then my experience is limited. Xinhua did not want to offend political actors here, and the articles of that time are, I believe, still online. Xinhua covered lavish social events at the Chinese embassy that drew Liberal and Tory MPs and senators. It refused to run any criticism of the Conservative government. But it turned out Xinhua's bureau chief collected intelligence for China, and he asked me to spy for him. He wanted information on the private meeting between Prime Minister Harper and the Dalai Lama in April 2012. So I quit, and I told him why.
Mr. Burry, we want to know why, but I need to move to the next person, and hopefully there's time for questions and comments. And we will also circulate your opening comments.
I'm okay if we give 30 seconds, if there's UC for 30 seconds.
Mr. Burry, then is that fine? We're going to give all opening comments 5 minutes. That means our time will be limited. Mr. Burry, please tell us why. Not too fast, the interpreters. Thank you. The floor is yours.
And I'm going to just go off the cuff here. The emails are in the material I sent. My emails back and forth with Xinhua. The bureau chief of Xinhua wanted me to ask around, find out through any contacts what happened when Prime Minister Harper met with the Dalai Lama, and he wanted me to file material about the Dalai Lama in Ottawa that he made clear would not be used in journalism, and I basically told him to screw off. That's the Coles Notes version.
Excellent. I can confirm that you blew the whistle on him. Thank you. I was just repeating what he said, just for the record. The documents have been shared. They are in translation, and until they are in both official languages, they will not be circulated, but they are on way, just so everyone knows. With that, Mr. Juno Katsuya.
Madame la Présidente, par intérêt de...
Chair, in order to make maximum use of my time, I'm going to skip some of my paragraphs in my presentation that I've provided to the Committee for Translation. Chair, members of the committee, I thank you for giving me an opportunity to share my analysis based on 30 years of work, research, inquiry, and analysis on Chinese intelligence services actions in Canada. This work as a counter-espionage agent, counselor in security and the private sector, and academic. And I can confirm that CSIS has been aware of the problem of Chinese interference in Canadian elections since the middle of the 1990s. At that time, my unit produced the Sidewinder report in collaboration with the RCMP, and we found for the first time in the archives of Election Canada that the Embassy of China had given money to the Liberal Party of Canada and the Conservative Party. At that time, the Chinese service was fairly clumsy. 30 years later, they've improved their techniques, their operations, with a lot more acuity and boldness.
Chinese operators. It is also caused by our own candidates, elected official, political staff that are either naive or calculate intentionally to gain power with the assistance of the Chinese government. The Chinese intelligence service are so good at it because they understand the electoral system, the weakness of the human being, and their work is on long-term gain. So today, I want to be very clear, and I want to be very clear. We can prove that every federal government, from Mr. Mulroney to Mr. Trudeau, have been compromised by agents of the Communist China. Every government were informed at one point or another. Every government choose to ignore CISA's warning either by negligence, self-interest, or partisanship. Every government were infiltrated by agents of influence acting on behalf of the Chinese government, and we knew who they were. Every government took decisions that are questionable about China and can only be explained by interference exercised from within or motivated by self-interest. Not only the sitting government have been compromised, but all federal political parties have been compromised at one point or another. The inaction of the federal government, all federal governments, were led to attacks on many municipal and provincial governments. Ultimately, every government has been part of the problem, not the solution. And remember, not only China is practicing interference. Considering these facts, I respectfully would like to propose some actions to be taken. 1. Establish a mandatory process for all future elected officials, political staff, and volunteers to swear and to sign a declaration that they are not under the influence or acting on behalf of a foreign government or entity. This form will clearly warn of possible criminal procedures in case of intentional deception. 2. Eliminate the possibility for foreigners to vote for the selection of candidates and nominees. This is an obvious nonsense. 3. Give an explicit and clear security briefing to all newly elected MP and have them sign that they attended and understood the briefing with, again, warning of repercussion in case of deception. Prevention is our best defense. Prohibit for a period of 3 to 5 years all leaving cabinets and senior public servants from working or participating to any activities or job related to their previous functions, and this being for foreign or national entities. 5. Doter le Canada d'une loi pénale sur l'ingérence étrangère.
Providing Canada with a criminal law on foreign interference, defining the activities considered illegal and the penalties. 6, create an independent office distinct from CSIS and the RCMP that would report directly to the House of Commons, and its director would be appointed by the House. The proposal to create a national coordinator is pointless. 7. The office should have the powers set out in the law, giving it the rights of a police force to inquire, search, proceed to arrests, or take legal action against anyone. 8, create a mechanism of control transparency in order to reveal cases of interference confirmed. And as I said, education and awareness are our best defenses.
Yes,
I know, but now we've come to the end of your time, and yes, okay, we're going to give you a little bit extra time.
Reduce the number of Chinese diplomats in Canada. It is estimated that 70% of the current staff are providing illegal intelligence duty in Canada, performing illegal intelligence duty. So remember that every week passing by weaken the Canadian public trust in our system, in our government ability or determination to do something, and ultimately our allies are losing trust and doubts about us. Don't underestimate this issue. Thank you very much for the extra time.
Thank you very much, Mr. German. Mr. German.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Chair.
Members of the committee, and thank you for the invitation. By way of a brief introduction, the Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute was established in 2021. It's an integral part of the International Centre for Criminal Law Reform at the University of British Columbia. We're a nonprofit, do project work internationally, research and writing, host conferences and workshops. On a personal note, I am a former Deputy Commissioner of the RCMP and of Corrections Canada. I also authored 2 reports for the Attorney General of British Columbia, now its Premier, entitled Dirty Money and Dirty Money 2. My intent in the next few minutes is to speak to outcomes, which actually works quite well following upon my friend Michel. Inevitably, this committee will be recommending legislative changes, which may include the creation of a registry and/or agency to deal with the issues that brought you together. Our experience internationally is that many, if not most, countries of the world have laws in place to deal with all forms of criminality. In this manner, they are compliant with international norms and standards. Unfortunately, few countries enforce legislation with respect to critical issues such as corruption and money laundering. Money laundering is the back office of transnational organized crime and walks in tandem with it. Money also plays a large role when dealing with election interference. How much, from where, and why are critical questions. Virtually all countries have anti-money laundering laws. Few actively enforce them. In Canada, our record has been spotty, although Budget 2023 and initiatives in BC do offer hope, as does civil forfeiture in the provinces. My point is that saying and doing are 2 different things. Canada must be a doer. We adhere to the rule of law and must project our belief in integrity and good governance to the world. So where does that leave you? When creating legislation, a registry, or agency, a few issues are vitally important. Verification. Information is just noise unless it is verified. The adage of garbage in, garbage out captures this issue. 2, public access. Transparency is key. With it, media and interested parties can provide a form of oversight that is critical in a democracy. 3, independence. Those mandated to deal with these issues must know that they are protected from attack, demotion, censure, or career challenge. 4, consequences. There must be consequences if individuals or entities fail to comply. 5, enforcement. Dedicated and funded enforcement entities are essential. The RCMP federally and Canada Elections Investigative and Enforcement Unit are already in place, but need strong legislation, secure funding, and timely access to prosecution services. For example, despite it investigating criminal activity, Canada Elections Investigative Unit does not have access to the valuable trove of information housed at FINTRAC. A final comment concerning the money. Funds used to influence the political system generally enter the political arena through domestic or foreign proxies. We refer to 3 stages in a money laundering cycle: placement, layering, and integration. The intent is to obfuscate the paper trail. Not surprisingly, money supplied by foreign influencers is more akin to the financing of terrorism, as it is used to commit a crime and is not the product of criminality, as is the case with traditional money laundering. Again, enforcement agencies need the legislative tools, the funding, and the specialized resources to follow the money trail. Members of the committee, yours is a particularly important role at a critical juncture in the life of our country. I thank you for your work, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. German. Appreciated. We have 6-minute rounds now. Questions will go through the chair unless we're pausing in between for purpose of interpretation and not getting personal. We will start with Mr. Nader, suivi par Monsieur Fergus, puis Madame Normandin, et puis Mr. Green. Mr. Nader, the floor is yours.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to begin by thanking Mr. Junot for being here. You mentioned that the CSIS has provided information on foreign interference in 2019 and 2021. And as a former agent for CSIS, could you tell us if you believe that the revelations in the press are credible? We're not certain if the source was from CSIS or some other organization, other organizations involved in security. That being said, the individual who was the whistleblower, caused a historic event. Otherwise, we would not be here discussing this issue. And this is something that I myself witnessed over the past 30 years. And unfortunately, of the secrecy that I've had to maintain, the Chinese have gained a lot of territory, a lot of terrain. But the Chinese have been very aggressive, very bold, and they've succeeded in making a lot of progress. And I think that, yes, there is a difference between the ethical responsibility and the moral responsibility. And I believe that the whistleblower acted morally, which, in my opinion, is more important than the ethical or contractual responsibility.
Now, but I want to follow up. You know, you spoke just now about very aggressive actions of the People's Republic of China, and the fact in your opening comments, as many as 70% of diplomatic operatives, diplomatics. Sorry, could you say that again?
This is a conservative number, 70%. Yes.
So you know, perhaps even more in the fact that I believe, according to an order paper response that our party received, there are 178 accredited PRC diplomats in Canada, maybe 177 now after events of the last few days. But given this high number and frankly the high number of people acting, you know, quite frankly illegally, what do you make of the fact that it took 2 years for this one diplomat to be expelled, let alone potentially 70% of all diplomats?
Well, thank you very much, because the comparison is really important. America is our greatest economic partner, and they have about 80 diplomats here in Canada. So twice as much Chinese, and we have a trade deficit with China. Where's the mistake is coming from? My speculation as an investigator is that, unfortunately, at Foreign Affairs or Global Affairs today, we have some people working naively, and non-intentionally, or maybe intentionally on behalf of China. And a certain sort of shake-up must be done on that side as well. Look how much time it took to make a decision on expulsing somebody that was so obvious. And I say, and I repeat in what I said in my comment, we've known for the last 30 years, we warned the prime ministers, we warned the cabinets about all those things. And people, for self-serving interests, for partisanship, or by negligence, neglected to take action. I may understand the political ramification, the economic ramifications, and other ramifications that exist. But at the same time, because we acted so weakly, it took place, this foreign interference, took place and was well rooted in our system as we speak.
So we've now expelled one diplomat. Do you think that will have any intimidation effect, or any you know, you talk about weak actions in the past? Is this a strong enough effect, you know, one single diplomat, or do you think there has to be a stronger?
It's a step in the right direction. It's not enough. That's why I'm suggesting that we should cut the numbers of diplomats in place here in Canada. There's no reason to have so many diplomats with a country that doesn't want to do business with us. We have a trade deficit. We sold a company, Nexon, in Alberta for $15 billion. We're not even capable to buy a corner store in China. So this discrepancy between the relationship doesn't sort of generate or justified, I should say, to have so many diplomats, other than some people are favoring China for the wrong reason.
Now, you mentioned in your opening comments a series of points kind of to beef up our legal framework. The first one, you talked about a mandatory process for candidates, for staff, with a signed declaration with the threat of criminal proceedings. What sanctions would you propose in terms of the criminal proceedings? How strong of a jail time?
Because we're close to treason here, literally. So I say jail time. Now the size of the jail time would be judged by jurisprudence and by our system, but definitely jail time. No fine, no suspended sentences or anything of that nature.
Mandatory jail time. In my few seconds left, in a CBC interview back in February, and you were reacting to the reports in the Globe and Mail at the time, you talked a little bit about the case of Kenny Chu and the fact that the Chinese community in his riding was manipulated by the CCP. I'm done, but if at some point you could elaborate on those comments. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're not asking for that now, correct?
Well, I've run out of time, Madam Chair. I respect
Perfect.
it.
I appreciate that, Mr. Nader. Monsieur Fergus.
Thank you very much to our witnesses today. I'm very happy that you've been able to come here to make a presentation. Mr. Junot, in your statement you said that for 30 years there's been negligence by all governments and there are persons who might be disloyal within the public service. And Mr. Bourly also referred to that MPs are targeted by these efforts, and spoke about the person in the news service, and what can be done to deal with this. This is a very real challenge, and unfortunately, the response of Mr. Harper at the time was to leave the individual concerned in his position. The woman left because there was a personal incident. It was her husband who discovered the relationship between the Secretary of State and the journalist, and it was revealed in the newspaper in Toronto. There were exchanges of emails. Was the Secretary of State removed from a position? And this is one example amongst the many others that I could cite. For all governments, all parties, unfortunately, there was this type of negligence, and that's where we see, and there's also the opinion of us amongst our allies. And there's a lot, as we heard, there's a difference between saying and doing, and Canada is losing credibility. And we have to rectify the situation because this is a historic opportunity to try and rectify the situation. And no matter what was done in the past, we can't do anything in the past. We can only correct the future. Chair, I'm not sure how much time I have left. 3 minutes.
For your testimony here, I mean, you raised some issues. You actually went out of your way to identify to the authorities as to what was the situation.
A considerable personal cost, frankly. I sent an email. Unfortunately, you don't have that material here, and it breaks my heart, frankly.
Just by the way, you can submit the material afterwards.
Oh, I have
if you
already
so
submitted it.
Okay, great.
Okay. I told the Xinhua guy, look, this is not what Canadian journalists do. I sent that to the press gallery. That was in April of 2012. They did nothing. This is the staff and the journalists who are on the press gallery governing committee. I finally went around and tried to get some sort of media coverage of it. I wrote an article that ran in August of 2012 in Ottawa Magazine, and finally people woke up to the fact that this was going on. But then nobody in the government contacted me. Nobody at CSIS contacted me. This is the first CSIS agent I've laid eyes on in my life, as far as I know. As far as I know. And the gallery tried to frame it as a dispute between me and Xinhua, and I said, no, this is a problem of you and your governance. So when Xinhua said they were going to sue me, I said, fine, this is not my dispute, not my monkey, not my zoo. You know, and left it at that.
So Xinhua asked you to spy on the PM, asked you to spy on the Dalai Lama.
Yep.
You reported this. What did Prime Minister Harper do about it?
Nothing. Nothing.
Not even a follow-up, an
Nothing.
acknowledgement?
It was absolutely, I was completely and utterly on my own, reliant on basically the strength of my wife to get through this. And couple of people in the press gallery. But in terms of the House, in terms of the government, in terms of the media, I was on my own. It was a dream world they wanted to live in, and I was not part of the dream.
I note for the record that another witness is going to be coming forward who is Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. What question would you ask, you would want to have asked?
I would like to know why, and this echoes my new friend, why they were so naive. I know, as I said in the sort of background, that this was Hu Jintao's time, that things have changed with the new regime in terms of the ugliness and the sort of mask falling on it. But even so, you know, where was anybody on this at the time?
Thank you very much, Mr. Bory. Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Madame Normandin, à vous.
Ms. Normandin? Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the witnesses. Very interesting. I'm going to start with Mr. Junot. You said that in the Sidewinder report that you prepared, we saw that the China was not that subtle in its efforts in the past, and nevertheless, governments at the time didn't react, and the attitudes of the government. Could you give some examples of their complacency with regard to these activities? Yes, indeed. The report was not tabled. It was destroyed. Everything that we had, our notes, everything was destroyed. As far as I know, there's only one copy still. The RCMP had one of its first copies, and examples over the years of decisions that were questionable. And one was mentioned by Mr. Fergus. That was trying to find out the inappropriate relationship between a journalist known to be a spy with a Secretary of State, and the answer was, oh, it's just a personal issue, and nothing was done. And I mentioned something earlier, the fact that we sold an energy business in Alberta for billions of dollars, and we can't even go and buy anything in China. When you have a $15 billion purchase, and you can imagine the incredible influence that can have, and I think that a company that has $15 billion to invest and thousands of employees, that kind of company will be received by politicians immediately. These are things that we've seen, and there were also cases where it was clear that there were meetings between United Front Work Department, the main agency undertaking interference activities across the world. There were agents in the community and in China. They've been paid to travel back and forth, and we also saw mayors from Vancouver, Ottawa, who were opposed to certain Chinese activities, who who've had trips paid to China and then when they came back, they adopted municipal bylaws to try and control the demonstrations in front of the Chinese embassy. And these are just some of the examples. There are also examples at the provincial levels, and the provinces have done nothing. There's no awareness. And when CSIS tried to inform them on the issue of intellectual property theft, they were reprimanded, saying that CSIS was not its responsibility, and so we can see now that the prime ministers have done nothing. I don't have much time, and I'd like to. You gave examples that it was really obvious, the efforts by China. And when we hear people say, well, we were naive at the time, do you think it was really naivety or personal interest that influenced their attitude? I can't speak for individuals, but I believe that in most cases, almost all the cases that I saw with the parties, even when they weren't in power, it was always personal interest. Thank you very much. And with regard to our international credibility and the fact that throwing CSIS under the bus, what kind of message does that send to your allies when you're criticizing your own intelligence service? It's very negative, and there are serious questions now being asked. There is a series of bad decisions and decisions we take a long time to make with Huawei and expelling a diplomat, cases of interference, even when there is proof. And I think that the action by this whistleblower has helped force us to deal with the situation, and we need to do it also for the United States. And I know that in the United States there's a Dragon Lord operation, which is aimed at monitoring the Canadian government and its relationship with the Chinese government. Starting since the 1990s, our allies already had doubts about our intentions and our ability to protect secrets that were shared with Canada. Thank you. Mr. Green?
I'm going to put a series of rapid-fire questions. Given that I only have 6 minutes, I'm going to ask that should I need to intervene and take my time back, you won't take it personal. It's certainly not personal. I'd like to begin with you, Mr. Juno Katsuya. I've had the privilege of sitting on committee with you in the past, and you've provided some compelling testimony at committee that certainly is in keeping with what you're saying here today. And in specific, you had mentioned that every single prime minister since Mulroney has been warned about foreign interference, and none of them did anything about this. I think we can all agree that foreign interference is a nonpartisan issue. Do you believe, or just so that I'm clear, the Act requires CSIS to report foreign interference only to the government. Is that correct?
Currently, yes.
And do you believe that CSIS should be required to tell, or should I ask, is CSIS required to tell the target of foreign interference about the interference?
Well, depending on the operational situation, sometimes we might decide to not inform the target right away, or the person that is targeted, in order to understand a little bit more the network and what is at play. But eventually, it is our responsibility to protect our Canadian citizens, because ultimately, our boss is not the government; it's the Canadian people.
And it is safe to say that there could be, well, there's different types of interventions, foreign interventions. One could be in favor of a particular candidate, boosting them, and you'd mentioned the nomination processes. I have a keen interest in hoping that there's recommendations from all of our standing committees on this particular issue that safeguard us against further elections. In your opinion, do you believe that the nomination process in the continuum of interference and influence is probably maybe one of the most vulnerable points of intervention that a government get involved in?
Absolutely, because it is one of the process that is the less regulated to a certain extent. It is left to every political party to decide who will be eligible to vote, who will be eligible to volunteer or to work on the political staff. So you've got here a pool of possible interference that comes at bay.
Did you ever come across allegations or information or intelligence, whether it was verified or not, that foreign actors, be they state actors or non-state actors, use nomination processes to find preferred candidates, to perhaps influence members of a particular community, ethnic group, or nationality to attend en masse and support one candidate over another?
Worse than that, I've seen candidates going to the consulate and asking for their
Going to
help.
the consulate, going to the state actors.
Going to the state actors and asking for their help in order to be elected, and they got elected.
And when that happens, and you've provided in testimony at Ethics, which I'm on, that CSIS, the RCMP, and other government agencies are using essentially spyware, right, to monitor Canadian citizens that might be involved in this domestically. I'm to understand that there would need to be a process for that there is a process from which they would have ministerial approval, perhaps the Minister of Public Safety. But there's also MPs sometimes that are targeted in this. Is that correct?
Yes, but just to be clear, usually we do not target Canadians. We target foreign agents, and if they are in contact with Canadians, then the Canadians might become.
The nature of smartphones is that it's a comprehensive capture. So everything that comes in would be captured by that. And so, with that being said, is it your testimony here today that there has been information collected that there were candidates seeking favor from foreign national consulates to get into the nomination streams domestically?
Correct.
And there are currently laws in place for that. And you had mentioned treason. I think, part of the challenge we would have around finding case law is that it's something that we probably all have heard of, but maybe don't fully understand. Can you just perhaps reflect for a moment on the importance it would be for us to have clear legislation in place that had clear consequences in place, that ensured that the threshold for that type of thing could be avoided in future processes?
In our jargon, we call them agent of influence.
Right.
Agent of influence, Stalin used to call them the useful idiots.
Yes.
Those useful people sometimes will either intentionally or by inadvertence go and offer their services simply because maybe they are seduced by a culture, by a country, or by national interest. They believe that they do the right thing, but unfortunately they don't understand that they are professional intelligence officers who are capable to manipulate them and eventually get what they want.
And in that instance, though, it's your testimony here for the purpose of this committee that capturing these processes, that there should be clear laws in place that should CSIS have information intelligence that is verified as per Mr. German, that a candidate is seeking out foreign support within a domestic nomination or election, that should automatically trigger a criminal investigation, which should have with it a criminal responsibility, which you outlined as jail time.
The problem that the problem that we currently have with CSIS and the RCMP is their chain of command, and the reporting goes directly to the Prime Minister, and that's where the road blocks.
And your testimony is that we should have an arm's length government agency, independent of Parliament, empowered by Parliament, nonpartisan, that would be responsible for the full safeguarding of our democracy to ensure that this type of interactions are fully verified and fully investigated and ultimately fully prosecuted?
Absolutely.
Thank you. How's that working for us? Yeah.
Okay, are we serious? We were doing so good. Let's just maintain how great we are all doing. Thank you for that line of questioning. I have to appreciate that. We're going to go into a quick second round, very quick. We'll go to 3 minutes to Mr. Cooper, followed by 3 minutes to Mr. Turnbull, a minute to Madame Normandin, followed by a minute to Mr. Green. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I would note for the record that the Xinhua News Agency, as well as the People's Daily, was banned from covering or being at Prime Minister Harper's 2013 Arctic tour, and that in a August 22nd, 2014 CBC article, Prime Minister Harper's spokesperson said that with respect to Xinhua and the People's Daily, that neither of those were welcome. Now, I'm going to ask Mr. Junot Castilla, through you, Madam Chair, a couple of questions. First of all, you had conducted an interview with CBC in which you commented on Kenny Chu, and you said something to the effect of, quote, the Chinese community in his writing has been manipulated by the CCP. Can you elaborate upon that?
One of the strategy of foreign interference by the Chinese is to infiltrate the community and to be capable to influence, even bully the community into acting or working in a certain perspective. With the avenue of the social media, great exploitation have been started to simply launch negative campaign against certain individuals that will eventually influence the community. The community, the Chinese community, the Canadian Chinese community has been well educated for decades how much reach the Chinese government had in the community. And they know that they are under observation. They have not been able to report it to the authority, and when they did, the authority in the past were not able to investigate adequately. So they felt totally alone, so they adapted to the situation. And unfortunately, what we have is a community that reads very often Chinese newspaper, which are affected or manipulated by the states and delivered their own message. And at the end of the day, they know that within the community, there is agent of influence, Canadian, acting on behalf of the Chinese government, that are reporting on individuals. And now, if that was not enough, we recently discovered that there was secret police departments, Chinese police stations in the community. All that form of supervision, intimidation, and bullying have controlled basically many of the Chinese community that in great numbers have relative backs in homeland China.
In the Steveston Richmond East riding and in other ridings in the lower mainland and in the GTA with a large population of Chinese Canadians, there was a significant drop in turnout and participation in the 2021 election. Do you think that's a coincidence?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That is part of also the manipulation. And we've seen, for example, Chinese foreign student been told and instructed by the consulate, giving a document with the pictures of candidates and going door to door and speaking in Chinese to the constituent and saying, you vote for this person, you do not vote for that person. And letting know or pretending that they are capable to know who they vote for.
Thank you. At the same time to Mr. Turnbull.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for your testimony today. Mr. Junot Katsuya, sorry, I'll start with you. So you've explicitly stated that we can prove that every government has been compromised from Mulroney to Trudeau, which is a big statement. I think it's, I had noted that I think you also said that previously at the Ethics Committee. We also heard from Mr. Boury that he was asked to spy on the Dalai Lama and the PM Harper at the time and blew the whistle, and Harper did nothing. And then I also connect this with a couple of years later, because I believe that was in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. In 2014, PM Harper signed a 30-year trade deal with China, and many experts at the time had really grave concerns that they expressed about how this may affect our national security. So, Mr. Katsuya, would you say that PM Harper was soft on China?
It became soft. It started with smoking guns right when he was elected the first time, even quoting me occasionally in the House of Commons. But with time, agents of influence were capable to gain access to him and change the course of his decision-making.
Was the 30-year trade deal that was signed by the Harper government, did it compromise national security? In your
National interests, at least, definitely.
Okay. I mean, you spoke to a sort of a trade imbalance in your previous remarks. Was that a result? Is that a fallout of, or an implication?
That imbalance have been present for decades now. It's always been present. We always had a trade deficit with China, so it didn't change anything. It didn't improve anything neither.
Okay, thank you. And did you table, or can you table your suggestions in your opening remarks? I believe we should have those, but I'd like to see them in writing if possible. I thought they were really good.
I did share with the clerk
Okay, wonderful.
my document.
I'm not sure if I have any time left, but Mr. German, I know you've spoken a lot about money laundering, and I would be interested in any further reflections you have about what we really need to do to prevent the stream of money that may be flowing into to support foreign interference.
Through the chair, thank you, Mr. Turnbull. You know, money is always present in these discussions, and I think, as I tried to point out, you know, we have to have robust legislation, which is something that Michel alluded to, and it has to be enforceable. And so not only does that mean that we have to have the investigative tools, processes, but we need, you know, adequately empowered enforcement agencies. And that includes the Canada Elections Office, which is a good investigative unit, but they need the resources, they need the access and so forth to make these things happen. But money is critical in all of this, and we do have the intelligence there. It's a matter of tapping into it and using it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Madame Normandin?
Ms. Normandin, thank you very much. For Mr. You know, you've heard that there are areas and ridings where there's more risk of interference, and what can be done to give greater attention to these ridings?
I think it's fair to say where there are ridings that contain a large number of people of Chinese ethnicity, you're going to see more action. You know, and more areas of concern. The other member mentioned Steveston. I lived in Steveston for many years. Certainly the Lower Mainland is a rich community because of the different ethnicities that exist in Greater Vancouver. But there's always that downside, and the influence of Canadian citizens who happen to have been born elsewhere or who happen to have relatives elsewhere is really an issue that we have to be alive to, and my friends have spoken to it with greater detail than I'm able to in terms of the actual specifics.
I agree. Indeed, in our system, all authoritarian governments interfere. This is nothing new. They try to influence, intimidate their communities, try to be part of those communities and to plant agents and to undermine the community. And so this is nothing new. And the problem we have today is that the system we have and the tools we have, as Mr. German said, we don't have the tools necessary. Thank you. Same time for Mr. Green.
Mr. German, you had mentioned the layers of money laundering, and I think there had been some comments around Canada's role as being a useful idiot, people being a useful idiot in some instances. In ethics, we're studying the Trudeau Foundation. That allegation was lobbied there. Mr. Zhang Ben, who is a multi-billionaire in China, a very influential person, provided a donation to the Trudeau Foundation. In your opinion, is that type of intervention influence, or could it also cross the threshold into interference?
Well, influence and interference, I'm not too sure if there's much difference. I think probably the distinction is does it become criminal at some point? And I don't have the answer, and I don't have the facts in that particular case. But what I did say in my opening remarks, and it's I think of interest, is that when we talk about money laundering, we talk about the proceeds of criminality. When we're talking about election influence, when we're talking about anti-terrorist financing, we're talking about money being used for a purpose. So it's at the beginning as opposed to at the end of the game.
Thank you so much. This is one of those panels where you do wish you had a lot more time, and that's why I say to witnesses, first of all, on behalf of PROC committee members, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your patience at the beginning of the meeting. If there's anything else that you would like to send to committee and like us to consider, please do share it to the clerk. We'll have it translated in both official languages and shared. Really do appreciate your insights today. We wish you a good rest of the day. We thank you for the work that you do, and we look forward to keeping in touch. So please keep well and safe. Meeting will suspend as we bring in the next panel. Thank you so much. Just kidding. I call the meeting back to order. In our next panel, we have Nancy Bangsbo, independent researcher by video conference. We have Thomas Juneau, associate professor, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, University of Ottawa, in person. And we have Christiane Leprecht, professor, Royal Military College of Canada, by video conference. You will each have up to 4 minutes for your opening statements, after which we will proceed to questions from committee members. Ms. Bangsbo, the floor is yours. Welcome to PROC. You're on mute, so can we try that again with us hearing your voice? Thank you.
Do you hear me?
We do.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. My name is Nancy Bangsbo, and I'm an independent researcher located in southwestern Ontario. Research has proven that the Tides Foundation USA provided a substantial amount of foreign funds to organizations in Canada, including Dogwood, Lead Now, Council of Canadians, and many others who registered as third parties and then worked together to influence the results of the 2015 election. My research has been focused on the riding level, the influencers involved in cities, and how these foreign-funded organizations and campaigns have affected not only our election results, but more importantly, government policies since 2015. The recipients of these foreign funds in Canada included organizations that openly declared commitment to defeating conservative candidates and a commitment to work together and vote together in order to achieve their various goals. They repeatedly did so in print, video, and robocalls in advance of and during the 2015 election. Significant evidence of the advantage given to the endorsed candidates was detailed in the Lead Now Defeating Harper report and in notes from the wrap-up meetings of Lead Now. I submitted a large complaint to Elections Canada in the summer of 2016, requesting that the commissioner fully investigate and prosecute the violations of the Elections Act and any other offenses, as the commissioner's own investigation exposed. In the winter of 2016, 2 investigators from Elections Canada visited my home, spending 2.5 hours reviewing the evidence provided in the complaint. Investigator Tim Charbonneau and I continued to correspond by email and phone until October of 2017, when I received my last email from him. He informed me that he was continuing his inquiries and had made considerable progress. He reminded me that in any case involving allegations of collusion, it was very important to speak to all the parties involved, and given the scope of this investigation, they had to talk to a lot of people. He thanked me for my patience. In May of 2018, I reached out to him again with more information, but he did not respond. Weeks later, I read a statement by Mark Chenier, I don't know the pronunciation, lawyer for the chief electoral officer, who was testifying on June 6th before the Standing Committee on Procedures and House Affairs. I was stunned to hear him say that the investigation into election interference was now closed. It was ended according to Mr. Chenier, or as he put it, we had to interrupt some of the commissioner's investigations because it was impossible to obtain the evidence we needed. In the political world, there are often allegiances. People provide mutual support to one another, and that is normal. So apparently, all of the evidence provided meant absolutely nothing unless those committing the offenses admitted it. I have only concentrated on Tides here, but there are many other influence groups doing the same things. There are so many of these highly funded organizations and activists now involved in our elections and government policy development that it's impossible to count them. And sadly, the average Canadian doesn't even know they exist. Thank you. I cut my statement short because I was trying to get under 4 minutes.
You did a wonderful job. I look forward to questions and comments from members. With that, we will now proceed to Professor Juneau. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So my focus of my remarks will be on the response of what Canada can do to better counter foreign interference with a focus on transparency. It's not the only element of our response that we can improve, but it's a central one that we underexploit. And basically, I'll make a pragmatic case or instrumental case why the lack of transparency has been counterproductive. The starting point for any discussion on foreign interference has to be the reality that the targets are often diaspora communities, and that among those communities, mistrust towards government and national security agencies is often high, and that can also be true among Canadians as a whole. And that is often one of the chief obstacles to better counter foreign interference. It makes cooperation and information sharing more difficult. Failing to understand, and that's one of the chief obstacles, failing to understand and address the limits the effectiveness of our efforts, because societal resilience has got to be one of our first lines of defense against foreign interference and other threats that we face today, like economic espionage and disinformation and others. But mistrust, compounded by poor transparency, unnecessarily lowers the ceiling for successful responses. Second, there's a lot of misconceptions in the national security community about what transparency is. Too often, transparency is viewed as an either-or proposition. It's transparency or national security. Transparency is additional work. It's costly. It's an irritating bureaucratic box to tick. These are all misconceptions. Transparency is, or at least should be, an enabler of national security. Less transparency amounts to fighting foreign interference and other threats with a hand tied behind our backs. In fact, it should be one of our key strengths or assets in the fight against non-democracies. But too often this is misunderstood, and that's a missed opportunity. Very quickly, and we can further discuss this, what can be done? More briefings, but also better briefings to parliamentarians, to political parties, but also training on how recipients of these briefings can use that information, because often that is poorly understood. More engagement, including through the development of specialized engagement units with minority communities, better engagement with the media, which the intelligence community does not do well enough, including local and ethnic media, better liaison with universities and the private sector. Communication here is much better than it was just a few years ago, but there are still a lot of obstacles to effective cooperation. That would include a better understanding within the intelligence community of the interests of stakeholders, their culture, their needs, how they might use that information, better engagement with the public in general through speeches, outreach, social media, parliamentary testimonies, public reports, annual reports with actual substance as opposed to jargon. By the way, one of the major obstacles to doing all of this is the epidemic of overclassification in the intelligence community. Also, related to this, transparency, the way that I frame it here as engagement in a sustained matter, also implies better information sharing, better coordination between the intelligence community and non-national security departments in Ottawa with provincial and municipal levels of government who have a key role to play. We see that now in the context of foreign interference. We saw weaknesses at that level in the context of the convoy last year. There has been much improvement, but there are still long ways to go. And so to conclude, this being more transparent, more engagement is a lot of work for an intelligence community that is already overstretched. It requires specific skills that are not fostered enough in the intelligence community. It requires more people, simply. It means that you have to define the parameters of the mandate of engagement units. What can they say? What can they not say? To who, in what context? It means you need political cover because engagement, especially in sensitive contexts with minority communities, can be sensitive. But, and I'll conclude on this, it is a necessary investment if, looking forward, we want to be serious in countering foreign interference and other threats that we face. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Lobrecht.
Madame la Présidente, je vous remercie de la...
Chair, thank you for inviting me to make a presentation to the committee.
Ultimate goal is to constrain Canada's capacity to make sovereign decisions. Foreign interference is fundamentally a matter of Canadian sovereignty. Too many Canadians and MPs are taking democracy for granted. Instead, a government that claims to have a values-based foreign policy should be defending and protecting Canadian democracy, freedoms, and way of life. Subversion by Beijing is the single greatest threat to Canada's sovereignty and democratic way of life today. Canada needs a coherent deterrence strategy that imposes cumulative costs on hostile state actors. First, lower the threshold for investigations by following the lead of our allies and establish in law clear thresholds for foreign interference as well as punitive consequences. Two, delineate foreign interference, subversion, and subterfuge. When a foreign hostile actor intentionally, deliberately, and repeatedly violates Canadian law and resorts to prima facie illegal as well as criminal conduct, that amounts to subversion and subterfuge. Three, foreign interference in Canada appears to be concentrated in large metropolitan areas. So, task the integrated national security enforcement teams, which have already proven themselves effective against terrorism, with foreign interference investigations and resource them accordingly. At a minimum, activities directed against MP Chong, his family, and ostensibly other MPs amount to conspiracy and harassment, which are criminal code offenses and thus readily meet even the exceptionally high threshold for expulsion of diplomats that the Prime Minister has laid out. Four, in effect, the CCP's United Front Work Department behaves like a state-sponsored transnational organized criminal syndicate. So let's treat it as such and shut down these thugs and their club secret police stations. Five, the UFWD is enabled by China having the second largest foreign diplomatic service in Canada. Why is Canada accrediting so many more Chinese diplomats than Canadian diplomats are accredited in Canada? Six, explicitly restore CSIS's subversion mandate that was abandoned after the Cold War. Seven, having just retasked the NSICOP with yet another study, for the purpose of this one study only, the Prime Minister could opt to turn the NSICOP from a committee of parliamentarians into a parliamentary committee, while giving Canadians public assurance that there will be no executive interference in the study. That would give the NSICOP, rather than the political executive of the day, latitude to decide on the content and timing of matters on which it feels it is in the national interest to report to Parliament. 8, build cross-party agreement on an integrated national security strategy, the way some of Canada's key allies have long done. 9, now that it appears that the Prime Minister may have misled Parliament, which is a very serious matter in a Westminster constitutional democracy, that is yet more reason for an independent public inquiry. Canada needs to draw red lines to stand up to bad actors by sending a cordial yet clear message that breaking Canadian law to constrain Canadian sovereign decision-making is unacceptable and will have real consequences. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous.
Thank you to you.
Round, starting with Mr. Cooper, suivi par Madame Romanado, puis Madame Normandin, et puis Mr. Green. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to start out directing my questions to Ms. Bangspool. In its report, Defeating Harper, Lead Now claims credit for defeating 24 Conservative incumbents in the 2015 election. Can you summarize how in that election Lead Now used funds and in-kind support from the U.S.-based Tides Foundation and other foreign actors and organizations?
Yes. The first thing you have to recognize is that money coming in through Tides US or any other foreign foundation is delivered to Tides Canada or many other foundations here that support activism. So you don't really, at the end of the day, always find out who's supporting who or which activist group is getting money from where. But I can tell you that in the study of just one riding, when we looked at the costs that that were, that gave advantage to certain candidates. We covered everything from flights because we knew in some cases where people were flying from as members of a team, and travel, whether it's car or whatever, from Toronto to London. We covered signs, banners, flyers, advertising material, radio time that they didn't have to pay for, food, T-shirts, rent locations, phone banks. The Lead Now office actually was in the Center for Social Innovation in Toronto. I don't know how they paid for that, but that's where their main office was. Polling's expensive. Any candidate is going to have to pay for all these things, but this was given freely. Facebook ads, online ads. David Suzuki was involved in a number of these campaigns and traveled with the crew to many different locations. That's hotel rentals and whatnot.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Bongspool. For you, Madam Chair, do you believe that any candidates received this kind of support in the 2015 election and did not report it to Elections Canada? Do you have evidence of that?
We couldn't find any evidence that anyone reported in-kind expenses from activist organizations, and yet at least 11 were targeted with full staff. I mean, here we had 7 staff members. They're all on salary. They're not volunteers, but they're dressed like volunteers, and they all had to get here, and they're working with Mr. Suzuki and a member of Mr. Suzuki's staff. So
11, Ms. Bongspool, 11 candidates received in-kind support with full staffs and did not report that.
According to the Defeating Harper report, 11 cities or campaigns were targeted with the staff. A lot of other cities did not have the staff. Those were where they had a primary interest in defeating the Conservative candidate and thought they had the best chance.
And you reported this to Elections Canada, is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And Elections Canada wasn't able to do anything about it. Will you undertake to provide this committee with supporting documentation that you have?
Absolutely.
Okay, much for that. I'm going to turn my attention now to and ask a question of Mr. Leuprecht. You referred to the United Front Work Department, and at the Ethics Committee, the brother of the Prime Minister, in respect of $140,000 so-called donation to the Trudeau Foundation, said that there was not the possibility of foreign interference and that the donation came from a Canadian company, a company that is a shell company based in Montreal, out of a house that is controlled by a company called the China Cultural Industry Association, which is part of the United Front Work Department. Do you agree that in that context there's not the possibility of foreign interference, or would you say that there was?
Mr. Cooper, open source documentation raising concerns about this donation dates back to 2016. And so we have had ample time to have an honest discussion, which I think people are not prepared to have. It is also why people are resisting a foreign agent registry, because of the number of Canadian elites that would get ensnarled in such a registry.
How much time?
24 seconds.
Mr. Leuprecht, I'll just allow you to use the balance of your time to add anything you wish.
These are very serious matters in a parliamentary democracy, and there are many options available to the government today if it wants to show that it is serious about defending Canadian democracy. We need to decide, are we standing with the tyrants or are we standing up for Canadian democracy?
Thank you. Mrs. Romanetto, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. The last panel we heard from had some pretty powerful testimony with respect to foreign interference and the fact that this has been something that's been going on for decades. My first question is to Professor Luprecht. In that last panel, and I'm not sure if you were watching it, we heard about the case of a Chinese state-run agency, Xinhua, asking a journalist to spy on the Prime Minister. A reporter at that same news agency was involved in a scandal with the Parliamentary Secretary to Foreign Affairs Minister, John Baird, Bob Deckrick, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing his name wrong, in an apparent honey trap operation. How concerning is it that this was all so close to an important ministry like Foreign Affairs?
There is other open source evidence about that is problematic with regards to John Baird in terms of financial matters, in terms of Jean Charest, which has been documented, as well as the former ambassador and cabinet minister, Mr. McCallum. And so we can see from the evidence you have provided that if we triangulate that there are multiple attempts to target the same individuals in different fashions, and that this effectively correlates with the type of operations that have been documented now against sitting parliamentarians today.
Professor Luprecht, I'm just going to follow up on what you just mentioned in terms of financial. Now, could you confirm that Mr. Baird went to work for a Chinese billionaire after he resigned from the Foreign Affairs post? And is that something that you think should be addressed in our legislative recommendations?
The matter of concern is public record, and it shows that the Canadian framework is not sufficiently robust to lay out clear rules as to what is and is not acceptable, both while in office and when out of office. And rather than looking back, the valuable work of the committee can do to make sure that we lay out much clearer rules, and we also lay out clear penalties for violating those rules, whether they're being violated by Canadians, by foreigners, or by accredited diplomats in Canada.
And further to that, our previous panel, Mr. Junot Katsua, also said that Prime Minister Stephen Harper became soft on China at the end of his mandate due to agents of influence getting to him. What would you make of that assessment?
As I've testified before the Canada-China Committee, I believe that elite capture is a significant challenge. Elite capture by China, both by pecuniary interests as well as companies and law firms that are related to elite capture. And as I've just stated, I believe this is the major reason for significant resistance and active lobbying against a foreign agent registry that has been proposed.
Thank you very much. And my next question is to Professor Junot. In full disclosure, we both have the same alma mater, McGill University. You mentioned a little bit, Professor Junot, about overclassification of classified information. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? And also, can you provide me any of your feedback with respect to the same questions that I asked the previous witness?
On the issue of overclassification, I mentioned that very quickly in passing, simply because as part of broader efforts for the intelligence and national security community to be more transparent in the issue of foreign interference, but also in dealing with other threats, economic espionage, disinformation, and others, overclassification is an obstacle to the sharing of information. I find, and I think it's a view that is shared by quite a number of observers, formers too, that a lot of information within government, within the intelligence community, is either classified while it could easily not be classified, or it should be classified, but it is classified at too high a level. And that makes efforts to share information with Canadians, generally speaking, with parliamentarians in many cases, including as we've seen in the news in the last few days, with civil society, it just makes it much more difficult. So as part of what I was trying to suggest of a broader, much more significant push to be more transparent, to help us better counter foreign interference, that is going to be a major obstacle. It is the result of a culture in the national security community that remains very insular, that remains very protective, where the incentive structure very much favors the overclassification. You can be penalized for not classifying information. You can't be penalized for overclassifying information. So it's very easy for me to just come here and say it's a problem. In practice, I fully acknowledge that solutions are not easy, but they are essential.
Thank you so much. And I have one last question, actually, for Professor Luprecht. Do you think then Minister Baird made any decisions at Foreign Affairs that lead you to believe that there was some level of elite capture?
I'm afraid that I'm not in a position to have sufficient, there's not sufficient information in the public domain to be able to draw conclusions, but concerns about the relationship and the consequences in terms of extradition of one individual, for instance, are a matter of public record.
Thank you. Madame Normandin, 6 minutes.
Ms. Normandin, 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'm going to start with Professor Luprecht, but Professor Junot as well, if you'd like to intervene. You spoke about the role of the NSICOP, and could you come back to the issue of whether they could replace a public inquiry? And I think there are other problems with NSICOP and the obtaining of information, sharing with the public, and I'd like to hear your opinion on the sharing of information with bodies like NSICOP.
Madame, c'est
this is a very important question, and I've written a book on it, Intelligence and Statecraft, with a chapter on how these things work in Canada. And I think my view of the current system in Canada is negative. The sharing of information is a problem, but I think that, as I say in my book, we have to show greater trust in parliamentarians because parliamentarians know how to use the information that they are provided with, and they're very well placed collectively together to decide how to use the information and how to share their conclusions with the public. So yes, I understand the hesitancy with regard to the structure of that committee and the problem of sharing of information, but I think that there are examples of other parliamentary committees in the United Kingdom, for example, where they do not agree with the current government in Canada that they cannot be trusted with this information. Thank you very much. Maybe a question for you, Professor Junot, if you want to also answer the same question, but with regard to declassification or classification and the role of the press. And the media were already aware of foreign interference, but weren't really interested in it. And could you give us some examples of declassification or sharing of information and with the press? And can you show how we can share and increase awareness by the population and increase the role of the media in the sharing of information? Thank you very, very much. Just a few words on NSICOP. First of all, I agree with Professor Luprecht that it should become a parliamentary committee, not a committee of parliamentarians. But I think it's important that in the files published, there hasn't been really any proof of influence. There's no really any proof of interference. The reports of NSICOP have been very good. The problem is not the committee itself. The problem is that it has been neglected by the government. One partial solution would be to create a procedure so that the government would be required to reply to the committee's reports, which is not the case now. And that would allow for drawing attention, public attention to the reports of the committee. That would help the media and the parties to discuss it more. And with regard to, you're right in your second question. I said earlier that the security community is not transparent with the public. Often there's very little sharing of information, and when there are responses to the media, when you try and find out information from these government offices, the responses are very brief or for form and appearance sakes. And I think that if we want to provide information to Canadians with regard to security and intelligence, we don't share enough with Canadians. And I think if we want to be more transparent with regard to Iranian Canadians, Chinese Canadians, and others, we have to give much more information to the media, and that's something that we just are not doing right now. Thank you very much. I don't have much time left. We had a proposal made that we should have an independent investigation office for foreign interference that would depend on the Public Safety Ministry, but rather under the RCMP. Would that be a good idea? I'm not convinced. We'd have to see what the details of such a proposal would be. I think the creation of a new agency in addition to the ones we already have, it's not necessarily the best solution. I would rather make better use of the existing resources and have better legislative mandates for the existing agencies. But I'm open. I remind you that there are already, as I said in my testimony, there's already the National Security Integration Enforcement Teams in all the big cities in Canada, and they've already dealt with the issues of terrorism and counterterrorism, and I think we could give them the resources and the mandate to also deal with foreign interference. The problem is that we haven't clearly defined what a foreign interference is and how to undertake these investigations, whatever the agency concerned. Thank you. Mr. Green?
Very much. I'm going to pick up on that because I do think that it's this committee's responsibility to provide sound governance recommendations, legislative changes, based on your testimony as subject matter experts. Mr. Juneau, you literally wrote the book, Intelligence Analysts and Policymaking, The Canadian Experience, and I think in it you covered some recommendations on ways in which we can support our security apparatus. I would share with you that I co-chair the Emergency Act Review Committee, and in that process, what we witnessed during the insurrectionist occupation of Ottawa, with tens of millions of dollars flooding into the hands of people who were intent on disrupting our democracy, there seemed to be a pretty clear breakdown from our intelligence apparatus and our frontline law enforcement. And the Rouleau Commission provided an opportunity for a very thoughtful and thorough analysis, not just on the use of the Emergency Act, but on the preconditions, on the failures. Is it your opinion that for this particular allegation of Chinese foreign interference, that an independent public inquiry might be the best nonpartisan space for which the facts could be helpful in determining the extent and the scope? I mean, to this moment, we've only heard of Mr. Chong, but I'm to understand there could be 10 more. Would you be supportive of an independent public inquiry?
Thank you. Just like to point out that the book you mentioned, I co-wrote it with a colleague, Stephanie Carvin from Carleton. On the issue of a public inquiry, I am honestly not convinced that it is the best way to go. I find that right now we have NSI COP, we have NCIRA, we have yourselves, we have a variety, Elections Canada, others, RCMP and CSIS have their own ways of dealing with some of this. The Independent Special Rapporteur will have his own recommendations. I am not convinced that the value added on top of all of that, an independent public inquiry, which would take a lot of time, cost money, drain a lot of resources, that it would really bring more than a marginal value added to everything we already have.
So is it your testimony here today that NCR and NSICOP could adequately deal with the allegations that have been made and provide adequate legislative frameworks in a minority government where we could be in an election within a year? Speaking of timelines, do you think that that's adequate?
NCIRA and SICOP and the others going on, but certainly, and again, if you look at the record of NCIRA and SICOP, if you read their reports, they are very good, they are independent, they are critical.
Not binding.
They're not binding, and that is a problem. I would agree with that.
Just to reiterate, to put on the record here today, would it be your recommendation from this committee and this study that we provide a binding feature within those bodies to force government into legislation? Because as it sounds now in the previous testimony, we're told CSIS only has to advise government. We were also told by the subject matter experts they have been told for the past 30 years that this has been a problem, every prime minister, and yet they've done nothing. And so how do we have an independent, nonpartisan, rights-based approach to this that doesn't weigh the economic interests of foreign trade with the democracy domestically?
Just a small point of clarification. I do not agree with the statement that was made earlier and elsewhere that governments have done nothing to counter foreign interference. I certainly agree, and I've written that they haven't done enough, the current government and its predecessors. To say that they've done nothing, I think, frankly, simply doesn't work. But on the issue of binding, I would agree with changes, for example, to NSI COP's mandate, making it a parliamentary committee. What I mentioned in answer to the previous question of the government having to respond to these reports. Making recommendations binding, I'm honestly not sure from a technical perspective how that would work, so I'm reluctant to say anything definitive on that, but I'm...
Well, I'll share with you, quite frankly, my concern in these very hyper-partisan times is that often, the outcomes are lost. And what's present in these partisan debates, and we hear it sometimes in testimony from witnesses, is, chasing the ambulance of whatever crisis is in the moment without any clear, reflective legislative changes. And sometimes it appears, between government and opposition that there isn't necessarily a willingness to improve and strengthen legislation. So would you maybe comment on, you've talked about greater transparency. We have a government who uses, client solicitor privilege, cabinet confidence, secret orders in council, obstruction to the production of documents at every parliamentary step along the way. And I think we can all agree that democracy is fragile globally. And right now, we're in a bit of a crisis, given the allegations that are there, the deepening cynicism, the lack of participation in our elections. So without putting all this on your shoulders, are there maybe 3 high-level recommendations that you think in a short term would help us address the cynicism coming out of this particular study and provide some legislative remedy?
Sure. I think a lot of them I mentioned in my presentation. More transparency generally, better engagement with parliamentarians, better engagement with civil society, specifically on foreign interference, better engagement with diaspora communities. That goes through the creation of engagement units. These already exist within CSC and CSIS in particular. They actually do quite a good job, but I think they're too small. So broaden and deepen their scope, their resources. NSI COP, having government respond, transforming NSI COP to a parliamentary committee. I could go on, but.
Thank you. Just to get us to the top of the hour, we'll do one question to the Conservatives, one to the Liberals. Mr. Culkins.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Given the fact that I only have an opportunity to ask one question, Mr. Lupprecht, in your opening remarks, you suggested that the Prime Minister may have misled Parliament. Would you give us the context in which you believe that that the Prime Minister may have misled Parliament?
I believe statements made over recent days and the way some of the communication has shifted with regards to Member Chong are highly problematic. And that in itself, I think, is reason to understand that, as I've reinforced, the legislative framework in place and our national security posture is insufficiently robust. Many of these problems could be solved by an Australian approach that has an automatic 5-year review built in. Our last systematic review of our national security framework, if you want, goes back to 1981, the MacDonald Commission. Clearly, we need a more systematic approach. It is not clear to me whether the Prime Minister's statement were with intent or was simply a function of the information, the best information available at the time, but it clearly shows that in terms of ministerial responsibility, there are some challenges in terms of the coordination between the Prime Minister and his own department and the statements that he subsequently has made on the matter.
Thank you. Mrs. Sahota, one question.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Going to Ms. Bangsbowl, Nancy Bangsbowl. You had mentioned at the beginning of your testimony that you do research. I wasn't able to find any articles or any, it doesn't have to be books or anything like that, but I wasn't able to find anywhere where your research has landed really and been published. So I was wondering if you can explain, where your research ends up first. And my second question is, are you a member of the Conservative Party, and are you a donor of the Conservative Party of Canada?
Yes, the reason you won't see anything published by me is I don't publish. I share my research with individuals who do publish. And I've done that deliberately for many years because I don't like the negative attention that you receive from individuals and organizations that don't want to be exposed. So I had no interest in exposing myself to that, but my research has been used by others. What was your second? I am a member of the Conservative Party.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
That was
Thank
one
you
question.
for your
I know.
testimony. Thank you for coming publicly, at least before this committee today. I'd love to learn more about your research in the future.
Excellent. That actually landed perfectly at 1 minute 28. So perfect. With that, I would like to thank you all for joining. I would like to join you all for joining us here at committee on behalf of PROC committee members. Thank you for the work that you do. If you have anything else that you would like committee members to consider, please just send it to the clerk. We will have it put in both official languages and shared with committee members. With that, we wish you a good rest of the day. Meeting suspended until we come to our third panel. Thank you. back to order. In our next panel, we have Ms. Jenny Byrne. Jenny Byrne, you will have, Ms. Byrne, you will have up to 10 minutes for your opening comments. Welcome to Prague.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. The committee and the work you are doing is critical to protecting Canadian democracy. And there's no way around it. The facts have come to light, so far extremely troubling. It is the most basic responsibility of the government to protect Canadians and our democracy from foreign interference. And it is increasingly clear that the government has completely failed in this responsibility, leaving our country vulnerable to hostile foreign actors. We now know, thanks to patriotic Canadians who are willing to ring alarm bells in public, that this government has been systematically turning a blind eye to illegal foreign interference from Beijing. New evidence of this country's cavalier attitude and willful blindness towards Beijing's interference in our country's electoral system seems to emerge every week, if not every day. This government has been aware for at least 2 years that a PRC diplomat was targeting the family of Conservative MP Michael Chong in Hong Kong in an effort to silence him. This is a genuinely shocking revelation and one that raises extremely serious questions about this government. Any intimidation of Canadians, whether directly or through their family members, by a foreign government is wrong. And in this case, Beijing was specifically targeting an elected MP for the principled and courageous position he has taken condemning Beijing's human rights abuses. That kind of direct interference in our electoral system cannot be tolerated. And what did this government do to protect Canadians or MP Chong? They did nothing. They didn't expel the diplomat or protest to Beijing until they were forced to by incessant questioning from the Conservative Party. They didn't even tell Mr. Chong what they knew was happening at all to his family until media reports. Now, sadly, this approach of turning a blind eye has been the government's standard way of addressing this extremely serious issue. The government's silence has left Canadians and their family members overseas more vulnerable than ever to foreign interference activities, and their indifference has undermined our democracy. Instead of doing their job and protecting Canadians, especially members of Canada's Chinese community, who are the primary victims and targets of Beijing's interference efforts, the Liberals have spent an extraordinary amount of time and effort trying to stop any independent investigation into foreign interference from moving forward at all. They only gave in and allowed these hearings when the NDP, their coalition partner, finally forced them to. Since then, we've heard disturbing allegations in connection with the Trudeau Foundation. Dr. Pascal Fournier, the former president and CEO of the Trudeau Foundation, raised the alarm over a donation that the Trudeau Foundation received from Beijing around the time that Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister before Xi became president. Astoundingly, Trudeau even appointed the president and CEO of the Trudeau Foundation at the time of this donation to author a report on foreign influence in the last election. It is clear that the point of this donation by a billionaire with ties to Beijing was to try to influence the Prime Minister. Dr. Fournier said there is evidence that members of the Foundation's board work with the donor to hide the true source of the funds. She also said she believed that an independent investigation was needed, but that the board members with deep ties to the Trudeau family refused. So she resigned. But some of those board members remain in place. It has since been reported that foreign donations to the Trudeau Foundation increased by 10 times around the time Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, and this while the Prime Minister's brother was an active member of the Trudeau Foundation. All of these attempts at foreign influence are concerning. Even more concerning is the government's obvious desire to sweep them under the rug. The Prime Minister couldn't even bring himself to call for an independent investigation into the problem. Instead, he appointed an old family friend who also happened to be a member of the Trudeau Foundation to look into the idea for him. It's become clear that this government does not take the threat of foreign interference in our political system seriously. If they did, they would be doing something about it. They would be trying to get to the bottom of these allegations. Instead, they are fighting at every step to shut down hearings and delay investigations. It often seems like this government and their friends are angrier at the whistleblowers and the journalists who are reporting on foreign interference than they are about the serious threat to our democracy that this foreign interference poses. As someone who has been involved in Canadian politics for more than 2 decades, who believes strongly in protecting our democratic rights and freedoms, I'm glad the Liberals finally were forced into taking a serious look at this issue, even if they had to be dragged here kicking and screaming. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for your comments. We will now enter into 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Cooper, suivi par Madame Romanado, puis Madame Normandin, et puis Mr. Green. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Byrne, for appearing here today. Yet I think Canadians are astounded at the level of interference that has come to light from Beijing, interference involving attacking and intimidating a sitting member of Parliament and potentially other members of Parliament, setting up of illegal police stations, and attacking our democracy in not one but 2 federal elections. It is now well established, based upon reporting by both the Globe and Mail and Global News, based upon their review of CSIS documents, that Beijing conducted a vast campaign of interference in the 2019 election campaign involving clandestine funding and the support of at least 11 candidates. We know that Beijing interfered in the 2021 election for the purpose of seeing the Liberal Party reelected. The Prime Minister received multiple briefings going back as early as February of 2020 about Beijing's interference in the 2019 election, so well in advance of the 2021 election when Beijing interfered again. And in the face of those briefings, the Prime Minister sat on it, took no meaningful action, and kept Canadians in the dark, despite the advice of CSIS that the best way to combat foreign interference is through sunlight and transparency. So, as the former Deputy Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Harper, based upon everything that we have seen over the past few months, that is truly astounding, can you comment on how the government has handled it and how Prime Minister Harper, based on your experience working with him, would have handled this type of interference?
Well, I believe that Prime Minister Harper had he been given these allegations, they would have been made. They would have been public, and they would have been acted upon. If you've seen how Prime Minister Harper handled things, for example, sending the Iranian delegation home, shutting down the embassy in 2012. That's how Prime Minister Harper handled things when he was briefed by CSIS. As the former Deputy Chief of Staff and National Campaign Director, both in the 2011 campaign and the 2015 campaign, I was never at one point briefed on any foreign interference leading into both of those elections.
Well, and I think you made an important point about Iran, because we were seeing back 10 plus years ago the Iranian regime targeting Iranian Canadians and interfering in our domestic affairs, and they were using accredited diplomats to orchestrate that interference. Prime Minister Harper shut down the entire embassy. He sent all of them home, back to Tehran. And we have, by contrast, a Liberal government that has turned a blind eye to Iran's interference, notwithstanding that they shot down, the IRGC shot down PS-752, and these Liberals, despite a vote of this House of Commons in 2018 to designate the IRGC as a terrorist entity, the Liberals haven't seen fit to do that. As a result, the IRGC is able to recruit, raise funds, and intimidate Iranian Canadians. Maybe you would wish to elaborate.
You're 100% right, and I'm very cognizant of the work that the Conservative caucus, led by Melissa Lantsman, has done in terms of bringing awareness and pushing for the Liberal government to list the IRGC as a terrorist entity, which would be the right and proper thing to do. And frankly, in light of what we have seen over the last 3 or 4 months in terms of dragging the feet in terms of an investigation into China, it's also very perplexing to me as to why they don't. It's a very simple thing to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization, and it's shocking that they have not done so up until this point.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I guess you should ask them.
Yeah, very good. What advice would you have given the Prime Minister if CSIS briefed you with warnings that a candidate running for the Conservative Party was part of a foreign interference network?
My recommendation, if I'd been briefed on that, would be that the person no longer be a candidate for the Conservative Party of Canada.
And by contrast, we know that this Prime Minister was briefed about a candidate who was part of a foreign interference network, and the Prime Minister turned a blind eye to that and allowed that candidate to run, and that candidate was later elected as a member of Parliament. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's an abdication of responsibility in terms of protecting the electoral integrity of the election to be briefed on something and not act on it.
Well, Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, I think this further underscores a Prime Minister who doesn't take foreign interference seriously, whether that interference comes from Beijing or Tehran or other hostile foreign states.
100%, yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mrs. Romanado.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And through you, I'd like to thank the witness for being with us today. Ms. Byrne, we heard in a previous panel today from a former intelligence officer that there is evidence of attempts at foreign interference that go back decades from quote-unquote Prime Minister Mulroney to the current Prime Minister, that there have been attempts at foreign interference. And you just mentioned that in your time as Deputy Chief of Staff, that you've never been briefed on attempts at foreign interference. Did I understand that correctly?
That is correct.
How could that be that the former Deputy Chief of Staff was not briefed at all by CSIS about attempts at foreign interference when CSIS intelligence officers have testified that there were attempts?
Well, I can't speak to that. I can tell you with all certainty I was never briefed on foreign interference. I know that Mr. Morrison, one of the former security advisors, has said that foreign interference has increased significantly over the last few years. But I think it's even more important that there be a public inquiry, which can go back. A public inquiry.
I'd like to just stop you because I do have very limited time and I want to share my time with other colleagues. In your capacity as co-deputy chief of staff, you would have been privy to mandate letters of ministers. Could you confirm if any mandate letters for any ministers, parliamentary secretaries, or department or any others had any reference to foreign interference and to combat foreign interference?
The last mandate letters would have been back in when a cabinet shuffled would have been in 2011. I was not working in the Prime Minister's office, but I have no recollection of whether they included foreign interference of it or not.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm going to turn my time over to Mr. Turnbull, who also has some questions. Thank you.
Thanks. So, Ms. Byrne, given your connection to the current Conservative leader, can you tell us why Mr. Poilievre chose not to do a single thing to strengthen our democratic institutions and protect against this threat when he was the Minister of Democratic Reform?
Well, there were no, as I said, we were not briefed on any threats, but I think it's...
So are you saying that there were no threats back when Pierre Poilievre was...
As I said, not that I was briefed on.
So we've heard from numerous national intelligence and security experts that this has been going on for over 30 years.
Well, then call a national inquiry and open the scope to more than the last 8 years.
I appreciate that, but it's a bit rich, don't you think, for you to make a whole bunch of allegations and claims at this committee about the current Prime Minister when the leader of the opposition today did nothing when he was the Minister of Democratic Reforms.
I think that's
moving on from that. Back when Mr. Poilievre was the Minister for Democratic Reform, Elections Canada asked for powers to investigate violations of the Act, but instead, Mr. Poilievre proposed to take away power from the agency. So I can imagine why Mr. Poilievre would want to remove investigative powers, given the fact that the agency was investigating him for elections violations at the time. But do you know why Mr. Poilievre tried to reduce the power and effectiveness of our elections agencies to respond?
Well, Elections Canada can absolutely investigate the actions of foreign interference going forward now.
So do you think giving Elections Canada less tools or fewer tools improves our response to foreign interference?
Well, Elections Canada can investigate now.
Elections
Canada, sir, can investigate now as well as there be a public inquiry.
Well, I would assume that giving them more tools, not less tools, would actually improve their ability to respond to foreign interference.
But what I'm saying is they can actually.
What you've said is that our government does nothing to address foreign interference.
You haven't.
Well, that's what you've claimed, but here we see
so I'm just
the
gonna,
opposite.
why don't you in your preamble, sir, tell me what you've actually done?
Why don't I pause?
I have quite a few things, actually. I have a 5-page list.
Mr.
But I'm not the
Turnbull,
witness
Mr.
here.
Turnbull, I have the floor.
Yep.
And I'm going to pause. And I think what might be the best approach is to go through the chair, providing the witness time to also answer, providing time for the question, and let's go through the chair. And that also provides time for interpretation. Is that suitable?
Through you, Madam Chair, I ask these questions because there's another fact here is that the former government's Elections Act changes really minister responsible for democratic reform at the time, who's the current leader of the Conservative Party, introduced a bill to make it harder for First Nations youth and vulnerable people to vote. Do you recognize, Ms. Byrne, now that that was a short-sighted policy?
Well, I believe I was called here to testify on foreign interference. Madam Chair, I would ask that I believe there's probably you would want to keep the questions relevant, considering I'm here for an hour. This is not a committee to discuss the Elections Act. We could do that another day. This
Point
is
of
to
order.
discuss foreign interference.
Point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Green.
Yeah, look, I know I'm a guest to this committee, but MPs have quite some latitude in asking questions they want to ask. I've never been in a committee where a witness directs members of Parliament on their line of questioning. So I would ask, as a chair, that you allow the member his parliamentary privilege to continue with his line so I can get to mine.
I'm sure there's many people who have been watching the testimony and guests who have been joining us, and we really appreciate the time. There has been quite a bit of latitude. And so I think that we will offer that today, and I would just ask that we continue going through the chair for the remaining 1 minute, just under. Mr. Turnbull.
Ms. Byrne, do you believe that making it harder for Canadian citizens to vote is a way to address foreign interference?
No, I think a way to address foreign interference is to for the government to take it seriously.
Thank you. I've seen reports suggesting that Conservative Party has sent operatives to the U.S. to study how the Republican Party's political machine works, a machine that includes dangerous voter suppression tactics. Have you ever participated in any kind of workshop or training sessions with the U.S. Republicans?
I have not.
Okay. Thank you. Do you think the snitch line proposed by the Conservative Party back in 2015 campaign, where neighbors would report their neighbors, does anything to combat foreign interference?
I think that the 2015 election campaign was not affected by any form, of foreign interference that I was aware of.
Thank you. Madame Normandin.
Ms. Normandin, thank you very much. Ms. Byrne, welcome to the committee. I'd like to come back to the 2015 campaign and what were the main threats to national security with regard to the election at that time?
Threats to, in terms of foreign interference?
De façon, non, les menaces de façon générale.
No, the threats in general with regard to the election.
Sorry, could you repeat yourself?
I'm going to just... So I want to make sure that with interpretation, Ms. Byrne, you know that whatever time it takes for interpretation for you to hear the question will be returned to the member. Perfect. And so we'll take a pause in between and let's just restart that time. 6 minutes à vous.
6 minutes again. Thank you very much. So my question was a general one. As a campaign manager, what were the main threats to the election? At the time, there were terrorist attacks. Can you say what risks there were at that time?
There were a lot of issues that were of importance during the 2015 election campaign. I would have to say, and I know that your NDP colleague is going to ask questions. The only form of foreign interference that I was aware of leading into the 2015 campaign was the Tides funding of Lead Now, that had a Vote Now organization that focused on 29 electoral districts, 16 of them being Liberals and 13 of them being New Democrats. And that money, admittedly, Lead Now said that 17% of their funding came from foreign donors. We know that in the year of 2015, that $1.5 million went from American organizations, from Tide, into Lead Now. And Lead Now, just for example, there were two ridings I'll point out. That were targeted, Elmwood Transcona, that the Conservative MP lost by 61 votes. There were paid staff and 130 volunteers that were put into Elmwood Transcona, where we lost by 61 votes. West Kootenay, Columbia isn't.
Si je peux me permettre, je vous demanderai.
If I may, I'm not asking for all the details, but how did you receive the information about this possible interference?
From press reports.
J'aimerais vous entendre.
I'd like to hear you on what we heard from a previous witness who said that all governments from over the past 30 years have been compromised by China or influenced by China, and and all governments, all parties have chosen to ignore interference. And do you agree with that statement?
What I can say is I know that I was never briefed on any form of interference from Beijing in terms of election interference for the two national campaigns that I ran. The difference between that and what we're seeing with the current government is evident that they were briefed several times and chose to ignore it. That is not my opinion. That is a undisputed fact, and we know that because of press reports.
Yes, but there is information that you might have, that you should be made aware of. That I'd like to hear you about the Harbour government defended Bob Fisher, who had a relationship with someone linked to Chinese press agencies. And do you think it was wise to keep him in his position?
I don't understand what you, like. I actually don't know what you're talking about.
So it's not in 2011, Stephen Harper defended Bob Richard, where it was public knowledge that he had had a liaison with a journalist linked to a Chinese agency. In the light of what's happening today, and do you think that was a good decision?
Not in the Prime Minister's office when that incident happened. I was the Director of Political Operations, but I can say leading into the 2015 campaign, I was not briefed by CSIS on any...
But I'm asking your opinion today. Would you support this same decision today?
Is if Prime Minister Harper had been briefed that there had been foreign interference with someone that was going to run, he would have dealt.
Madame Byrne, en tout respect.
Ms. Byrne.
Je vais demander encore.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you again that all interventions be made through the chair, because I want to have an orderly meeting. So I would ask you to ask questions and make comments through the chair. Thank you. Chair, through you, I would ask the witness her personal opinion. I'm not asking if she was aware. I would ask her personal opinion today, given what we know now. Was that, in her opinion, a good decision by Prime Minister Harper to maintain the MP in his post when we have strong criticisms of the work or the attitude of reaction of the government today?
Well, I can't have an opinion on something I'm unaware of. My understanding is there was no briefing or any or briefing regarding Mr. Deckert in terms of the what happened in 2011. And as I said, all I can say is, as the campaign director in 2015, CSIS never informed me or briefed me on any concerns they had with any candidate that ran for the Conservative Party of Canada during the 2015 election campaign.
Au risque de me répéter.
Even if I'm repeating myself, and in the media, in the press, over 12 years now, in your opinion, today, based on what we've heard, was it you consider it to be a good decision?
I don't think there's been enough information. I'm telling you that there was no briefing and there was no evidence provided. There were newspaper reports. CSIS hasn't come out and said that they briefed the Prime Minister of Canada, and he ignored that information, unlike the party here.
Alors, à cet effet.
So, does the witness believe then in what is reported in the press?
Yeah, well, I believe what has been reported in the press regarding foreign interference in the 2019 and 2021 campaign, because the Liberal government has admitted that it's actually been true, and the information is coming from CSIS officials who obviously feel so concerned about what's going on in terms of the ignoring of briefings on foreign interference that they obviously feel the only course of action they have right now is to actually be whistleblowers within the press.
Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And welcome to committee, Ms. Burns. I know that you're well adept in these spaces, and so I'll put a series of questions to you in a rather rapid fire way. I will respect the chair, but I feel like I could probably ask them in a respectful way that might not require an intervention. Just to confirm, you were the campaign manager for Mr. Poilievre's leadership?
I was a senior advisor.
Senior advisor. Are you going to be the national campaign manager? Has that been announced?
Is there an election coming up soon?
Probably. You know, you'd referenced non-state actors, which I think is an important point, and a point that hasn't been raised, of course, is the tens of millions of dollars that flowed into the country during the convoy. We know that if you were a senior advisor to Mr. Poilievre during that time, and we recognize Mr. Poilievre's relationship with the convoy. You referenced Ms. Landsman. We know that Ms. Landsman was the first MP to provide a petition calling for the end of vaccine mandates in the lead up. What was your advice to Mr. Poilievre to ensure that there was a firewall between the insurrectionist actions of the convoy and the leadership campaign at the time?
In terms of the convoy, I believe that Liberal Justice Rouleau stated that there was actually no evidence that foreign money or foreign interference was actually part of, that he found any evidence that was part of what happened in terms of the Freedom Convoy. You were on the committee, so you would probably have...
And go send me, but about $1 million coming from the United States.
I'm just sorry, I paused the time for a second. Yep. Mr. Fergus?
I'd like to apologize to my colleague to put a point of order. It's just that there was a statement regarding a member of Justice Rouleau, and I think there was an adjective added to that by the witness, and I'm just trying to figure out, is that a title? Because clearly that's not the case as far as I know. That anybody who's a member of the judiciary is appointed on or has memberships in political parties.
I'm going to return the floor to Mr. Green.
Let's try to keep points of order to actual standing orders so that we can continue with this. My question was against advising in a time when $10 million is going to Tamara Lich. She's from the Maverick Party. There's close connections between senior conservative MPs and the movements. You have the leader and the leadership, or you have Mr. Poilievre in a leadership race, which you're a senior advisor for. I mean, it's a fact that $1 million came in. We know that to be true. And so I'm just wondering, what advice would you have given Mr. Poilievre, given the close relationship to the Conservative Party and the convoy, to ensure that foreign interference did not occur?
Well, if you're talking about donations, over 62,000 people donated $9.7 million to our leadership campaign.
Specifically, to what advice would you be providing in this moment to the leader in the leadership race to ensure that there was no... Did you take any precautions? Let me just put it that way. If the answer is no, you can say no and we can...
Well, what the precautions, I guess the only thing you could be talking about would be fundraising. So that's what I was trying to address. So...
I mean, it could also be memberships. I mean, presumably, with the numbers that have been reported, there had been lots of allegations during the last leadership race about inflated numbers, fake numbers. We've heard testimony from expert witnesses that nomination races are a prime place for foreign interference.
Well, it might be in other parties. I know that the Liberal Party of Canada has a free membership. I'm not sure what your party has. Ours is a $15 membership, 1-year membership, and people must pay by their own credit card or they must pay by a personal check.
So there was no advice given at that time from you as a senior leader to Mr. Poilievre regarding the relationship between...
There's very clear Elections Canada rules regarding leadership, and there are very clear party rules regarding leadership. So in terms of the donations, as I said, over 62,000 people donated, close to 9.7...
Of course, that foreign interference can happen outside of elections. Can we find that common ground?
Well, we've seen it based on the reports we've seen from the Liberal Party in terms of nominations across the board.
I think there was also some allegations on the Conservative side as well, provincially as well. Mr. Brown, Mr. Ford, Mr. Charest, lots of that stuff seems to float around during leadership time. So I guess during your time, you had mentioned that you had never been briefed on matters from CSIS as a senior advisor in the Harper government. Was it something you ever considered, though, even if you weren't briefed? Was there ever a time when this topic came up and you felt it necessary, either in a partisan role as a national campaign director or operative, or in a PMO role?
No, I never said I wasn't briefed by CSIS. I said I was never briefed by CSIS on foreign interference or any matter.
Yeah, that was what I asked.
Regarding that. No, it never came to mind because there was never any thought that I had that there were foreign actors that were participating in the into the election process, except for the press reports leading up to the 2015.
I find that, I'm new to the Hill, been around less time than you, but I find that odd. I find that highly suspicious that somebody with that kind of security clearance would never consider foreign interference, given that you would be briefing, given that we have 2 committees on it, and we have, what I would consider to be high-level security clearance. At no time did the topic ever come up, given the height in which the role in which you played in these governments?
Leading into the first time I had considered that foreign interference could be a problem was what I said in terms of Tides Foundation funding Lead Now, which was
all your time. It was just, I find that, quite frankly, and I'm saying this not to be personal, and I'll say this to the chair, I find it highly suspicious. Either you knew, and I'll use the framework of my friend Mr. Cooper, either you knew and did nothing, or you didn't know and you're incompetent. I'm not saying you're incompetent because I consider you to be a highly intelligent person. So using the words of Mr. Cooper, who I've heard use that phrase for many of my Liberal counterparts, which one is it?
Okay, well, Mr. Green, prior to, of course, Tides funding campaigns that helped both you and your coalition partners in the 2015 election, please tell me when there was any reports of foreign interference in a Canadian election.
You've completely ignored all the
I think we
testimony
just turned,
leading up to your arrival
Mr. Green?
here. It's a level of
Mr. Green?
hubris that's normally
Mr. Green?
reserved for the Liberals, but I'll leave you to it.
Mr. Green, and I know, Ms. Byrne, you're well aware that committee members get to ask the questions and comments, and you have agreed to appear. And I do appreciate that you were going to take time earlier in the week and that you're coming back again, or last week and coming back again, so thank you. I will go into the second round. Mr. Nader, followed by Mrs. Sahota. Mr. Nader, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, thank you to our witness. I will note that I'll be splitting some of my time with Mr. Steinle. You mentioned in your opening comments, Ms. Byrne, that the Liberals seem to be angrier at whistleblowers and the media than they are about the actual issue at hand. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't know why it is. I think that this is an issue they obviously don't want to talk about it. There's a reason why they haven't called a public inquiry, which would have been a very easy thing to do. There's a reason why they dragged their feet and filibustered this committee. So Katie Telford, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, wasn't able to attend. There's the fact that they lash out at media that ask them questions and claim that CSIS is wrong, only to of course, having to backtrack. Of course, the Prime Minister said that CSIS never, the briefing note that said that MP Chong's family was targeted in Hong Kong, the original answer by the Prime Minister, and he was very hostile about it, was that it never made it out of CSIS. Well, now we find out that it's actually made it out of CSIS, and one of 3 national security advisors would have received it and not actually read the brief. So I'm not sure why I guess they are hostile because there's obviously something that they are hiding.
And following up on the allegations, Mr. Chong being threatened, his family being threatened, and there is actually indications that it could be multiple MPs. And given the fact that this was a result of a Uyghur motion, I would note that the Liberal cabinet abstained on that Uyghur motion. How concerning is it from someone who's worked 20 years in the political apparatus? How concerning is it that members of Parliament are being threatened by foreign operatives on something as fundamental as human rights around the world?
I think it's extremely concerning. Mr. Chong has been a long defender of human rights abroad, and it was his motion on the treatment of Uyghurs within China that by the Beijing administration that actually caused his family in Hong Kong to be targeted. And to your point, Mr. Nader, this was a motion that the Liberal cabinet abstained from, as well as some backbench MPs, as well as a couple backbench NDP MPs as well. So I think it's extremely concerning. It casts a chill, and it should cast a chill for every member of Parliament, regardless of what political stripe they are, that if a government allows this to happen, it makes every single one of you a target of foreign interference based on votes that you have, based on your right to vote and speak in the House of Commons and put forward motions.
And final question before I pass it to Mr. Steinley. We saw last weekend at the Liberal Convention, a failed U.S. political operative as one of the keynote speakers. And we actually saw a former Liberal leader make a joke about foreign election interference. Do you think it's appropriate to be making jokes and making light of something as serious as foreign election interference?
No, I think I think it absolutely is not, and I think it speaks to the heart of where the Liberal Party is right now. Is that they do not take this issue serious. They just do not like the fact that the opposition and the media refuse to let up until they actually get answers.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here, Mrs. Burns. Question for you is Lead Now's interference in the 2015 campaign strikes officially hard at myself because we lost Regina Louvan by 132 votes that election, and the Liberals knew of this interference of over $1 million pumped into the election in 2015. Why do you think they didn't investigate that foreign election interference?
Well, maybe because it benefited them, but I think that's a question you should ask them.
So, piggybacking onto that, if we haven't seen them investigate that, would you agree, and you said it here today, that even if there should be a public inquiry, but it should even go back further than the 2019 campaign, so you think the Liberals would agree to having that public inquiry date back to 2015?
I think if there is a public inquiry and if officials feel that there was foreign interference, which I have no idea if there was prior to the 2015 campaign, based on the media reports that I've seen, then I believe that is something they should already have called.
Last question. If there is not a public inquiry, is that a condemnation of the Liberals not taking this seriously?
Well, I can't see at this point how there can't be a public inquiry. I think it would be. I think that from what has come out in terms of the hiding and the misinformation and the targeting of Mr. Chong, I do not see a scenario where David Johnston cannot call a public inquiry, which is from an issues management point of view, which is why this government, who continues to get caught kicking and screaming, it's just an indictment in terms of how their issues management process has been on this issue completely.
Thank you. Mrs. Sahota.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question to the witness is regarding statements made by her on a podcast called Curse of Politics. There was a discussion regarding the 2021 election, and in that you noted, and I quote, that one can agree with the strategy, but you can't argue that the strategy worked. So the strategy, meaning the Conservative Party strategy, did not work, is what you were implying. If you look at BC, we lost 4 seats in the Lower Mainland. We lost support in 4 of 5 of the Surrey ridings. You can't tell me that our strategy worked in the Lower Mainland. It just didn't. There were many issues in that campaign that affected voters in that region, and I'm sure you did a post-analysis of many of those reasons. I talked to many candidates and MPs that were elected from that region, and legalizing assault weapons was a major issue that came up at the doors. They heard from Chinese Canadians that the legalization of assault rifles was something that was an important election issue to them. Now, there's never one election issue, and I think this is something that you mentioned on that podcast as well. It sometimes is accumulation of many issues. Do you believe that the Conservative Party, do you still stand by those words, that the strategy didn't work? The Conservative Party strategy at that time did not work for those ridings?
Yeah, I think I was clear. As I said, I had nothing to do with the Central campaign in 2021. I was very clear that I disagreed with the campaign's direction on a few things, most notably campaigning to support a carbon tax as well. I think was an extremely big one. I think that. I don't think it's mutually exclusive. That I think that there were several factors in terms of why in the last election the Conservatives did poorly, especially in suburban urban ridings in GVRD and GTA. I think there's several that does not mean that foreign interference didn't happen. I don't think the election result would have made a difference. I really don't. But I don't think that takes away from the fact that we should be very concerned in terms of foreign interference in our elections.
Absolutely, and I actually agree with you that foreign interference perhaps did not have the result of overturning those riding elections. However, it is important to take steps. That's why we're here today. That's why we are even in unanimous consent looking at the privilege motion regarding Mr. Chong. That is why a foreign agents registry is going to be implemented in the coming months. There's been consultations taking place. That is why we set up NSICOP and all of the different procedures that have been set in place. I think all of us around this table and many witnesses agree that actions have been taken by this government, and there's more that we can do to continue to strengthen our democracy so that foreign interference doesn't take place. I do find it very strange and odd that we've heard from most experts here that had any advisory roles when it comes to our partner agencies such as CSIS, that foreign interference has been a big problem for a while. It's a growing problem, like you say, and that's why we're taking these actions. But for you to say today that there was no knowledge, absolutely no knowledge of this until, other than Lead Now and other than this last election, seems, in Mr. Cooper's words, suspicious. It really does seem suspicious. Or you've built up some type of structure in that time where you were the advisor to Mr. Harper and where you were happy to be ignorant about what was taking place. So I'm wondering whether you had ever provided advice to the previous Democratic Reform Minister, our current leader of the official opposition, Mr. Poilievre, that policies should be put in place to make sure that we are protected. And you mentioned Iran in today's testimony as well, not just China, Iran, and maybe others that you might want to comment on.
Yeah, as I said, I was never briefed on the potential of foreign interference leading into elections. There was no reports I was privileged to or that I received. There were no briefings by CSIS that candidates were compromised. There was no, for example, like what the report was leading into the 2019 election campaign that went from NSICOP through to PCO and up to the Prime Minister that said that there was a concern by CSIS officials that there was going to be foreign interference in the 2019 campaign. That never happened.
Also not be likely that... thank you.
Madame Normandin.
Ms. Normandin, thank you very much. I'd like to come back to the issue of local interference with regard to tides. And at the time when you were campaign manager, how did you deal with that in the context of the election?
Well, as I said, I was never briefed as a campaign manager on foreign interference. There was not one time that I was briefed as the national campaign director or as the deputy chief of staff that CSIS had a concern on foreign interference leading into an election campaign.
And not with regard to internal interference, not just a foreign, domestic interference?
No.
I'd like to wonder with regard to interference from other countries, Russia, United States. There was never even any discussion that there was a possibility of such kinds of interference?
There's never any briefing that I received that that there was foreign interference leading into either of the two national election campaigns that I ran.
Beyond the briefings, in your own personal knowledge of the possibility of this existing, did it ever occur to you that there could be a possibility from Russia, United States, Iran, any country? Was that ever suggested in the campaign without having a briefing? Was there ever any inkling that you might have had some interference?
There was no concern in terms of interference. The only discussion we had, we know leading into the 2015 election campaign that the Liberal Party of Canada worked very closely with the Democrats in the U.S. in terms of developing their database and campaign techniques. But that would have been the only conversation that we would have had, and I think it's probably safe to say I would agree that would not that did not seem to constitute interference. That just seemed to the Liberal Party deciding to go to the United States to usurp some campaign techniques from the Americans.
And never was there any question of discussion of foreign interference in the campaign?
No, I can't. There was never a discussion, minus leading into the 2015 campaign when media reports reported that the Tides Foundation gave at least $1.5 million to Lead Now to run a campaign to support 29 Liberal and NDP candidates in 29 select electoral districts.
Thank you. Mr. Green.
Thank you. In the spirit of nonpartisanship, I'm going to attempt to find some common ground on some things I think we can agree on. You would agree that a full, independent public inquiry might be or is the best way for us to go back as far as we need to go to reassure Canadians that there is a fulsome investigation, review, and recommendations coming back to the House of Commons?
I agree.
And you'd be willing to go back as far as necessary to ensure that the testimony that we've heard would cover off in a nonpartisan way both ruling parties, both governing parties in the last 2 decades?
Yes.
And would you agree that having timely and open and full access and transparency as it relates to documents, in instances, of course, relating to national security, would help Parliament provide or the Commission provide the best framework to address the issues that have been raised?
Yes, I think so.
And in your time, and you've mentioned the decades of work that you've had, and you referenced your party, but you alluded to other parties. Would you also agree that there could be revisions or alternative ways in which nomination processes happen to ensure that we're safeguarded against foreign interference as it relates to the mobilization for memberships and candidates?
Well, I think, as I said, I think every party handles nominations. I think every party handles nominations differently. As I said, I don't know what the NDP is. As I said, the Liberals have a free membership system. Ours.
So you're okay with the current system as it is now?
The current well, each party has a different. Each party.
That wasn't what I asked. I'm just saying. In
Well,
your,
it would. I think that Elections Canada already has a process that political parties have to follow that process. If political parties are afraid that there is foreign influence within their nominations, like what's happened with the Liberal Party, then I think they must do things.
As it relates to NSICOP and NSIRA, do you think that they're adequate bodies to deal with this, given that we had them, but yet we're still here?
Well, I think that I can't listen. The fact of the matter is that NSICOP provided a report for the Prime Minister leading into the 2019 campaign, and it was ignored. So I'm not going to comment.
Or then that there should be a mechanism when those reports should also come to the House?
Yeah, I think I'd be open to that.
And do you think that there should be legislative processes that would ensure MPs targeted for foreign interference are made aware that the interference happens in a timely way?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Byrne, if you would be indulge us, could we ask for 10 extra minutes of your time past the hour?
Sure.
Maximum. That way we can give Mr. Cooper his 5 minutes and complete this round, and then Mr. Gerritsen, and then we'll thank you for your time. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The CSIS in July 2021 had a report detailing that a diplomat, Zhang Wei, at the Toronto consulate had orchestrated an intimidation campaign against sitting member of parliament, Michael Chong. We know that that report was provided to the National Security Advisor at the PCO, as well as to the relevant departments. And we know, according to the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, that the Prime Minister is routinely briefed on national security matters. According to his Chief of Staff, Ms. Telford, he reads everything and nothing is held back. And yet, in the face of that, the Prime Minister wants Canadians to believe that he learned about this in the Globe and Mail, something that couldn't be more serious when we're talking about a foreign hostile state and an accredited diplomat targeting a sitting member of parliament to interfere in their ability to do their job on behalf of their constituents and on behalf of Canadians. Now, so in the face of that, it's very difficult to believe what the Prime Minister is saying, and even if he is being truthful, and I have real doubts about that, it speaks to his lack of seriousness with respect to foreign interference, and is an indictment either way. But we need to get to the bottom of that, and I put forward a motion today at committee to do just that. And so it is my understanding that there is an extensive tracking system within the Prime Minister's office for sensitive documents. As someone who has worked in the Prime Minister's office in senior positions, can you tell us how documents are tracked within the Prime Minister's office?
Well, with the Prime Minister's office, PCO is the traffic cop, so to speak, of documents that would go to the Prime Minister. And these tracking sheets are actually very extensive from what I remember. They not only indicate that they go to the Prime Minister, they indicate every official that they go to, so on the bureaucratic side, depending on the department. They also track, obviously, which agencies they would go to, and it also tracks what political staff they would go to. And so these would be available, and it would be very, very simple for the Prime Minister to direct PCO to make public that tracking document to find out where this mysterious briefing note and who it was delivered to, because tracking notes for what I gather are not from what I remember are not top secret or not classified documents. So this would be something very easy if the Prime Minister and the government were truly open to figuring out where this tracking note somehow got lost in the delivery. It would be very easy to find out which officials, which security agencies, and which political staff received it.
Thank you for that. And Ms. Byrne, through you, Madam Chair, in the motion that I put forward at paragraph E, there is an order for production that provides that within 1 week that the distribution of that document within the Prime Minister's office, the PCO, the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, and the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness be provided to this committee. Do you think that's a reasonable request? Is that something that could easily be handled?
I think it could easily be handled.
Okay, thank you for that. And just to be clear, changing gears a little bit, just to be clear, you did not deal with the site task force on behalf of the Conservative Party in the 2021 election, correct?
Correct.
Nor in the 2019 election?
Correct. I was not centrally involved. I door-knocked for some local candidates, both in 2019 or 2021, but I had no role within the central campaign.
So no formal role in 2019 or 21?
No.
So why do you think you've been called here today?
Well, you know, I thought about that. I know on the surface it's the 2015 campaign, and I know so I think there's probably a bit of politics, considering I know that one of the asks that I know there was a counter motion to have my friend Anne McGrath called before committee, someone who actually was the national director of the NDP for the last two elections. So I think that there was a little bit of politics here to have me and not members of the other party.
Thank you. Our last round, Mr. Garrettson. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Byrne. Thank you for coming here today. You noted in your comments earlier on that you didn't receive any information or read any reports regarding foreign interference, but
I did not receive any reports.
okay. In 2013, CSIS's public report identified foreign interference as an existing threat and one that was going to continue to grow into future years. Did you read that report?
I do not recall.
Did you receive that report?
I
you
do
were
not.
You were the deputy. You were
I
the
was
deputy chief of
I
staff
was the
at the
deputy
time?
chief of staff. Yes.
You don't recall?
Do not recall.
You paint a very different picture of Stephen Harper than some of the other witnesses that have come before us today. A former intelligence officer said, and I quote, Stephen Harper became soft, and quote, on China, and quote, agents of influence were capable to gain access to him and change the course of his decision making, end quote. A former parliamentary correspondent said that he was left out to dry by Stephen Harper when he had first-hand knowledge of foreign interference. He asked us a question to ask you, so I will ask that to you. Perhaps you heard it in advance. His question is, why were you and the Harper government so naive on China?
I cannot answer for the Prime Minister. As I said, I have no knowledge in terms of what the gentleman that testified here
Telling you what he said. He said he claimed that Stephen Harper was naive on China. The intelligence officer before him said that Stephen Harper was soft on China. Why were you guys in the Prime Minister's office not taking those threats seriously?
I have no evidence to say that that there was any evidence of that. I was not, as I said, briefed on that, and I do not recall the public report to CSIS.
But in fairness, you didn't have to be briefed on it. It was a public document by CSIS. But I have a series of questions for you. Yes or no are sufficient. So if you wouldn't mind indulging me. You were never briefed on foreign interference after a Chinese state news agency asked a reporter to spy on the Prime Minister.
I was not.
You were never briefed on foreign interference after the same news agency was involved in a honey trap operation with a Conservative parliamentary secretary.
I was not.
You were never briefed on foreign interference when a year earlier, CSIS Director Richard Fadden publicly warned that some politicians were falling under the influence of foreign governments through personal relationships.
I was not, as I was not in the Prime Minister's office at the time.
Okay. And you were never briefed about foreign interference after John Baird took a job with a Chinese billionaire.
I was not. I was in 2015, I was the National Campaign Director.
You were never briefed about foreign interference after that same Chinese billionaire donated $1 million to the National Art Gala while sitting next to the gala's honorary chair, Laureen Harper.
I was not.
Madam Chair, I'll turn the rest of my time to Mr. Turnbull.
Ms. Byrne, NSI COP, Critical Election Incident Public Protocol, Site Task Force, the Rapid Response Mechanism, Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, the Plan to Protect Canadian Democracy, Bill C-59 and Bill C-76. That's 8 things that our government has done since 2015. Can you name 8 from the Harper era?
Can say is that regardless of all that, yes
or no?
Well, are you going to let me respond, Chair?
If you answer the question, yes or no.
Well, I'm going to answer the question, but I don't.
Okay, I'm going to
offer
pause the
8
time.
things?
We're doing very well. As we've always said, we ask questions, we answer. I've been in that chair once upon a time where I did have the chair of committee, that committee say to me really quickly that we know time belongs to members. I believe witnesses should also get time. So I will just say the status quo around here, you've been in these hallways, is that it is the members' time. Mr. Turnbull, I would ask that we just give the witness time to answer.
Regardless of the 8 things that you have named, we are still sitting here with the fact that for the last 2 elections, knowingly, your government ignored advice from officials in terms of foreign interference.
Could you name 4 things?
As I said, we are still sitting here where your government is dragging their heels after repeatedly ignoring.
How about just 2 things? I'm sorry to interrupt, Ms. Byrne, but we have very limited time.
Well,
How
I
about just 2
understand you're
things?
trying. I understand you're trying to turn this, but this has nothing to do.
I'm not trying to turn anything. I'm just asking you a
absolutely
simple
are.
question about whether in the Harper era, we've heard many witnesses say that the Harper government did nothing. You've claimed that our government has done nothing, and you asked me a question, which is the opposite of how these things are supposed to go. I gave you 8 examples, tangible examples, and you can't give me one. I find that telling.
Well,
Okay. I'll move on. Madam Chair, how much more time do I have?
10 seconds.
Okay, I'll just thank the witness for being here today.
With that, we
Madam
have.
Chair. Madam Chair, I would like to move a motion that the committee allocate sufficient time at Tuesday's meeting to deal with my motion concerning Mr. Chong.
So I'm just confirming that we are losing services. We don't have resources left. We can deal with this motion that you want to move at the next meeting. It cannot be dealt with today. But Ms. Byrne, I do want to thank you for your time today. If there's anything else that you do want to add, please just send it to the clerk. We'll have it translated in both official languages and provided to all members. With that, meeting adjourned. Keep well and safe, everyone. Thank you.